Hello, everyone. I've had a lot on my mind about Germany, the country I live in, and the country that one of my parents is from recently, and how it's developing, both on its own, but also things that have been happening recently. And I want to just lay it all out in this video. I'm not sure how much in-depth knowledge the average non-German has about the current situation in Germany, so I hope that this video can make you think about certain aspects of Germany today and make you question its development. With the rising popularity of far-right parties, worsening economic conditions for average Germans, and a rising rate of police violence and suppression, I want to look specifically at Germany's history with fascist parties and how that history lingers and shapes modern-day politics and society. I've broken this video into 6 parts, so if you really only care about modern-day Germany and the crux of the video, you could skip on to part 4 and 5, although I'd really recommend listening to the first parts as well, as it'll provide some relevant information. Now, before we start, I just want to briefly state that if you think the title of this video is somehow an accusation towards every German, then you're wrong. It isn't unfair to point out how a current-day society is influenced by its past, especially when the past is so unavoidably and intentionally linked in the way Germany is today. This is not a slight on Germans, but on the society within the Federal Republic of Germany, a society that I belong to, mind you, which is partly why I think I made this video. At the end of the day, it's the individual German's decision what to do with its influence. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into the video. Now, if we're to talk about fascism in Germany, it's important to understand the conditions in which the Nazi Party was created. After World War I, the former Weimar Republic was left in shambles. Nearly 1 in 5 of its male population had either died or been seriously injured in the war, leaving a massive hole in its labor force. The country was billions of euros in debt and had been blockaded by the Allied forces, leading to mass starvation and deaths in the civilian population. On top of all this, a pretty significant part of the German public hated the Weimar Republic and blamed it for losing the war. Up until the end of the First World War, the German Empire had been led by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Afterwards, a new democratic government was formed, which would soon begin peace negotiations and eventually sign the Treaty of Versailles, an embarrassment for the growing number of German nationalists because it would essentially put the responsibility of the entire war on Germany, as well as put a limit on how big their military could be in the future, which sparked rumors that Germany had been stabbed in the back. In 1919, after the war had ended, during a parliamentary investigative committee, former German army generals and politicians such as Karl Helfreich, Erich Ludendorff, and Paul von Hindenburg had begun spreading the lie that the German army was not defeated on the battleground, but rather stabbed in the back by communists, socialists, and Jews. A transcription from that committee reads, "The intentions of the command could no longer be executed. Our repeated proposals for strict discipline and strict legislation were not adopted. Thus did our operations necessarily miscarry. The collapse was inevitable. The revolution only provided the keystone." Now, the accusation that either Jews or socialists could be held responsible for the defeat in the First World War can be easily disproved. By reading diary entries of German soldiers, you can tell that the generals in the German military had already considered the war to be a lost cause at least by October 1st, 1918, a month before the armistice would be signed and the Weimar Republic was formed, and a whole 8 months before the war was officially over. Instead of accepting responsibility for a military defeat, generals started spreading the lie that it was actually the new government or the socialists who had infiltrated it who were to blame. This was accepted by a big part of the German population because, for one, nationalism was growing, but also because for years the public had consumed no news of the war other than Germany's victories, and now all of a sudden they had not only lost the war, but also their military and some of their territory. Of the military defeats that were known to the public, some were blamed on Jews for instigating labor strikes, which affected the military's ability to have enough equipment. This, coupled on top of Europe's already growing anti-Semitism, laid the perfect groundwork for the German Workers' Party, later renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, to be founded in Munich. What started as a small group of German nationalists and anti-Semites having a weekly meeting at a beer hall would soon turn into a nationwide movement once Adolf Hitler, a veteran of the First World War, joined the party. Allegedly, the story goes that while Hitler was working as an education officer for the German army, spreading anti-communist propaganda and sentiment, he was sent out to scout one of their weekly meetings. While listening to the men talk, he felt understood and related to their hatred of communism and Jews. One man at the meeting spoke out against the party, to which Hitler responded with an impassioned speech defending them, and the party organizers liked him so much he was accepted as a member later that same week. Hitler was particularly liked for his speeches. People said he was both charming and persuasive, and within a few months he had become one of the party's most important members. In the next few months, the party grew and grew, in large part thanks to Hitler and his speeches, which attracted people that identified with their ideology. Hitler and the Nazi Party believed that the German or Aryan race was a superior race to all others and believed a racial hierarchy should be established. Jews, homosexuals, Roma and Sinti people, immigrants, handicapped people, among other groups, were all labeled as asocials that held back the great potential of the German people. They were against all forms of immigration and decided that Germany should only allow in and give rights to German people with pure German blood. They thought that a racial community, or Volksgemeinschaft, as well as extreme nationalism would bring the Aryan race into its deserved spot at the top of a racial hierarchy. All of these things can be read in the party's 25-point program, which was put out in order to attract new members and to market their goals. Now, there may be some confusion as to why the party had decided to rebrand itself as the National Socialists, or why some of their early programs included things that some socialists would actually agree on, but this can also quite easily be explained. During the Weimar Republic, although there was a growing population of people who became nationalist, anti-Marxist, anti-Semites, there was also a growing population of socialists and leftist political parties. These points and the name change proved to be an easy way for the Nazi Party to convince some working-class people to support them. We know that their leftist talking points were never meant to be taken seriously because, well, Hitler said so himself. While the 25-point plan is what was shown to the public, behind closed doors, Hitler also wrote less well-known, exclusive pamphlets for industrialists and capitalists, such as The Road to Resurgence, in which he wrote that the anti-capitalist measures outlined in the 25 points would not be implemented if the party were to gain power in Germany. Hitler would gain more support in 1929 when the Great Depression caused the Americans to recall their loans in Europe, leaving millions of people unemployed and wages at an all-time low. With growing support from the German public, the Nazis slowly began to win more and more seats in parliament. After winning 230 seats and becoming a majority in the Reichstag, Joseph Goebbels, the head of Nazi propaganda, wrote in his journals, "We have won a tiny bit. Now we must come to power and exterminate Marxism. One way or another, something must happen. The time for opposition is over. Now deeds." Hitler is of the same opinion. Now events have to sort themselves out, and then decisions have to be taken. We won't get to an absolute majority this way. Hitler soon began openly expressing his more extremist views, emboldening Nazi Party members to commit violence against Jews and political opponents in the streets. One such case that stuck out to me while researching for this video involved a young communist who had his eyes gouged out with a billiard stick and was later stabbed to death in front of his mother by 4 Nazis, who would then be publicly defended by Hitler himself. Despite instigating most of these altercations, Hitler promised that only he could re-establish peace in Germany and save them from the horrors of communism. As both support of Nazism and communism grew, the German industrialists and conservative elite grew afraid of a communist revolution like the one that had just happened in Russia, and sent a petition to the now president, Paul von Hindenburg, to appoint Hitler as chancellor. And at the age of 43, Hitler had finally gained the power he wanted when he became the chancellor of Germany. Just a few months later, Hitler would propose a law that would allow him to rule by decree, without having to run his new laws through any form of government. The law would need a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag to pass, and with the support of the current president, some important industrialists, as well as the outright banning of the Communist Party to participate in the vote, the law was passed. Hitler had effectively begun his reign as a dictator, but he still had to take care of the political opponents before leading Germany into another war. Between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July, in what's known as the Night of Long Knives, a purge of political opponents was carried out by the SS and Gestapo. This included the former Chancellor of Germany, communists and socialists, other political opponents, and even other Nazi Party members who disagreed with Hitler on how Nazism should be implemented. With the power to create or change any laws he wanted at will, he banned labor unions and parties of opposing political beliefs. In fact, in 1933, the first concentration camp was opened in Dachau, and I think it's important to note that the very first people who were persecuted and put in these camps by Nazis were communists and other leftists. Soon there would be 20 to 25,000 political prisoners locked up in concentration camps around Germany. Now, before I get into World War II, there's one more topic I need to touch on, that being the communists in the Weimar Republic and why it was Nazis who came to power and not any of the leftist political parties who opposed them. Hitler writes, "Germany, England, France, and Italy are dependent on exports. Indeed, even America is leaving the purely domestic economic circuit and is emerging as an industrial competitor on a worldwide scale, helped, to be sure, by sources of raw materials that are just as cheap as they are inexhaustible, especially in the sphere of the motorization of the world. America appears to be cornering the whole world market. In addition, the outside world has succeeded in breaking down a number of German monopolies on the world market thanks to coercive restraints of wartime and the result of peace treaties. Finally, however, the economies of the world's great industrial states are backed up by their political power, and the decisive factor in economic conflict in the world was never yet rested in the skill and know-how of the various competitors, but rather in the might of the sword they could wield to tip the scales for their businesses and hence their lives." On top of being nationalist racists, Hitler and the economic elite in Germany had one more thing in common that communists and other leftists didn't, that being zero interest in changing the fundamentals of how the economic system actually worked. Hitler himself actually wasn't too involved with economic planning. He virtually left everything running as is, and as long as the corporations did what he told them to do, it was a mutually beneficial arrangement between Nazis and capitalists. Hitler and other fascist governments tend to try to make their countries fully self-sufficient so that they would have to rely less and less on foreign countries. In Nazi Germany, this was done by government spending programs, one of the most famous of which is the building of the Autobahn system, which Hitler then used to try to get the German public to spend their money on Volkswagens. With the Nazi-controlled German labor front established, all unemployed German men were conscripted to at least 6 months of mandatory labor for the German state, doing labor, working in factories, or basically anything that needed to be done. While these things certainly helped put some money in people's pockets, it isn't as simple as the unemployment rate went down, so it's good. For example, you had very little choice in what you wanted to work at. The government controlled where you had to work, how much you got paid, and took away your right to strike. On top of this, Jews, political prisoners, and most importantly, women weren't counted in the unemployment rate, which I guess if you remove over half of your population from eligibility and conscript the rest, then yeah, the unemployment rate goes down. Despite the Nazis' best efforts, however, Germany never even came close to becoming fully self-reliable. I point these things out because for all the talk about how the Nazis helped Germany's economy after they came into power, very little actually changed for the average German. They may have had a job, but they had no right to strike, no labor unions, the freedom to choose in which industry they could work was limited, and wages were frozen almost immediately after Nazis came into power. It should be obvious at this point that while these things weren't very good for the citizens of Nazi Germany, they were very good for the industrialists who supported and funded the Nazis' rise to power. Many of us have been taught to look at this period in history in a specific way, that Nazis were a terrible thing that happened to Germany. But that's false. The economic elite who were in power during the First World War, who were in power during the Weimar Republic, turned to Nazis as a way of destroying communists in their country, the single biggest threat to the status quo that threatened their position in power. In this sense, Nazism is not something that was inflicted upon Germany, its people, and its institutions. Nazism was the natural progression of what Germany became to defend itself from a growing political ideology that threatened the power and income of a few privileged industrialists. Opposing communism and socialism was as core to being a Nazi as hating Jews was. It's important to speak about this topic in depth because it's not only disrespectful, but incredibly dangerous to simplify all of Nazi ideology into being anti-Semitic. Hating Jewish people is not the only thing that qualifies one as being a Nazi. That's why so many prominent German capitalists not only supported, but made it possible for the Nazis to grow like they did, because fascists and capitalists have more in common with each other than a communist. Industrialists like Günter Quandt, Friedrich Flick, August Baron von Fink, Kurt Schmidt, Gustav Krupp, Hjalmar Schacht, and the Porsche Piech family all funded or contributed in some way to the rise of the Nazi Party, with almost all of them getting away completely unaffected by the war and the quote-unquote denazification that followed, with many of their descendants and family members still very much a part of the same economic elite that influences German politics today. But we'll get to their children and their influence a little later in this video. I know that I completely skipped over the German Revolution, so I highly recommend this 3-video series going in depth about the German Revolution, the development of communist ideology in Germany, and how it was crushed with the help of the economic elite directly funding counter-revolutionary measures that would soon be adapted into the new Nazi government, as well as some other German political parties. It's a really interesting but complex part of German history that deserves to be discussed in depth, and I didn't want to shrink the entirety of this movement into a brief summary. I'll end this part of this video by reiterating one point. Communism separated the working class from the ruling class. Not only did it explain inherent flaws in a system, but it motivated people to work towards dismantling the power structure. What Nazism and fascism does is it erases the lines between these two classes with the broad statement, "We are all Germans, we are all just Aryans." Ernst Borsig, one of the richest German industrialists at the time, an ardent anti-communist and supporter of the Nazi Party, writes, "I believe that in Hitler I have found a man who could help to bridge the gap between the different social classes through the movement he launched, especially by revitalizing the national spirit of the workers." In September of 1939, Nazi Germany would invade Poland, officially starting off the Second World War. Now, we've already talked about Nazi ideology, but there's one facet of it that needs to be understood if we are to talk about the imperialist aspect of Nazi Germany, that being the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. Hypothetically, Nazi Germany could have just minded its own business, stayed within its borders, and then who knows what would have happened. But Germany was just not enough. No, the master Aryan race needed more space to live and become self-sufficient. So naturally, with France, Spain, and Britain in the west, the Nazis looked to the east as land that was theirs for the taking, something that most Nazis didn't need too much convincing of since the east also was home to lots of Jews and Slavs, another race that Nazis considered inferior. We've briefly talked about how Nazism ingrained itself into the German economic power structure as a method of self-defense, but now I have to talk about Lebensraum and how that idea came out of already present cultural norms and ideas in Western European and American societies. That connection isn't at all difficult to make since Hitler and other big believers in Lebensraum repeatedly made that connection themselves. At the end of the First World War, Germany had lost all of its overseas colonies in Togo, Namibia, Tanzania, Papua New Guinea, as well as several others. This loss of colonies and the accompanying loss of resources forced the German state to think of the East as the next most natural progression. The Nazis were obsessed with becoming completely self-sufficient, but the reality is that Germany in its current form simply could not produce everything it needed to run its society without the help of the outside world. The solution was simple. The territory that was considered Germany would have to grow. In 1936, Hitler spoke about the raw materials of the Ural Mountains, the forests of Siberia, and the farmlands of Ukraine. Fortunately for the Nazis, they came to power in a part of the world that is no stranger to expansionist ideologies. But whereas the colonial powers of France, Britain, Belgium, and Spain had territories overseas that they extracted resources from, Hitler instead wanted to directly annex these new conquered territories into a greater Germany. Nazi expansionism wasn't just colonialism, it was specifically settler colonialism. That being when one race or one group of people comes in and replaces the existing population, either by resettling them somewhere else or simply exterminating them. Now, does that sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, it should, because that's literally manifest destiny, or the ideology that allowed the American colonies to become what they are today. Early American settlers had the idea that because of their own greatness, whether that be racial, cultural, or intellectual greatness, the natural thing to follow is the expansion of their territory, and eventually destiny would manifest itself into America being the strength and size that it deserved to be, from sea to shining sea. If you grew up in the United States, I know that they probably taught you that song in school. During a table talk, Hitler said there is only one duty, to Germanize this country, the former Soviet Union, by the immigration of Germans and to look upon the natives as redskins, a clear comparison between his ideology and the American expansionist one. Now, normally, I would move on to the next point, but because I know my audience is mostly American or European, I feel like I have the need to justify myself further. To this day, some disgusting Western historians and political theorists will swear up and down that Lebensraum and Manifest Destiny were and are completely separate ideologies with no links and correlations between them, and that comparing the two is to ignore the many details that separate them. A very common argument I've seen used is that Lebensraum used racial supremacy as justification for expansion, whereas Manifest Destiny and other European expansionist ideologies use the implementation of democracy or culture or the correct values as the reasoning for their expansion. Now, while that in and of itself is a racist idea to hold, here's the 7th president of the USA, Andrew Jackson, using that same line of thinking, but in a much more direct way. My original convictions upon this subject have been confirmed by the course of events for several years, and experience is every day adding to their strength. That those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear. Were these two ideologies exactly the same? No, absolutely not. But it would be disingenuous to assert that they were not both ideas that were born out of the same mindset and background, or that they weren't in any way linked, with one of them clearly influencing the other. We can talk about the intricacies of the ideology and the political systems that were influenced by it all day long, but at the end of the day, both of them motivated the populations of their respective countries to ethnically cleanse and mass murder, for the purpose of expanding territory and influence, because people believed that because of some innate quality of their character, that meant that they deserved it. I spend time talking about the core parts of Nazi ideology because it's important to place Nazis into the context that created them. The Nazi Party and its ideology was inhuman and evil, but unlike the way that they are presented in most Western schools, they were not unique in their evil. Nazi ideology, to its core, its ideas about racial hierarchy, its need to become self-sufficient by invading other countries and taking their resources, killing and enslaving populations, establishing a national racial identity as a means of erasing discussions about class, its anti-Semitism, and its support from the economic elite, all of it was the result of centuries of those very same principles exerted by Germany and its European neighbors onto the rest of the world. The big difference with the Nazis was that this was the first time that the effects of those same principles would be experienced in Europe. I'm going to read an excerpt from an article in the International Journal of Human Rights, which I highly recommend you read after this video, that summarizes characteristics of genocide put forth by Raphael Lemkin that I think will serve as a good base that we can work on from here on out. For those unaware, Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish man who fled Europe once the Nazis invaded. In the early 40s, as he was writing a book to describe the Nazi occupation and the party's policies towards people considered inferior, he coined the term genocide, and he would devote the rest of his life towards writing the aspects of genocide and campaigning to make the crime of genocide illegal under international law. In this important book, Lemkin constructed a sociological ontology of genocide, with Chapter 9 in particular implying sociological claims about the nature or structure of nations and the necessary conditions for their survival, and detailed 8 techniques of genocidal destruction that were employed during the Nazi occupation of Europe: political, social, cultural, economic, biological, physical, religious, and moral. Lemkin's sociology and the analytical framework he constructed in Axis Rule and later unpublished works is crucial to our understanding of genocide as a socially destructive phenomena and also as an analytical concept. For Lemkin, genocide was a total social practice affecting the essential foundations of life of social groups, and crucially for this article, it is intrinsically linked to the process of colonization. Genocide has 2 phases. 1. Destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition, in turn, may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone, after removal of the population and the colonization of the area by the oppressor's own nationals. From that description of genocide, from the man who coined it himself, we can understand that genocide and colonialism aren't necessarily 2 different things, and that the act of colonialism itself constituted a genocide. I think a lot of people think of World War II and the Allies specifically as teaming up to defeat the Axis out of a mixture of self-defense measures and some moral calling they had to stop the unnecessary violence. But the United States, Great Britain, and France all actively engage in genocide regularly, and some heads of state even consider the rise of fascism to be a good thing. Not only were these countries similarly economically structured, but they also shared the same hatred of communists. It should be of no surprise that some industrialists abroad would also help fund Hitler's rise to power. American industrialists and businesses like Rockefeller Standard Oil, the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, as well as prominent banks like JP Morgan, Chase, and Manhattan Banks, all contributed in one way or another to funding Hitler's rise to power. Among these elites who helped Hitler's rise to power was a certain American banker, Prescott Bush, father and grandfather to two future American presidents. The complete list of the American economic elite that funded the Nazis' rise to power is too long to write out here, but for a comprehensive look into it, check out the book Trading with the Enemy, The Nazi-American Plot, 1933 to 1949. I don't feel like it's necessary to go over the beats of the Second World War and the Holocaust in this video, partly because everyone should know about it by now, but also because there are many videos online that are dedicated specifically to that topic, and I've provided several resources in the description of this video for further reading. Instead, I think it's much more important to focus on who was fighting who and for what reason. To do so, we'll have to talk about some of the main Allied powers' responsibility for the Nazis' military defeat and their respective heads of state, mainly Churchill and both the British and American governments. Let's start with Great Britain and Winston Churchill because it's the most complicated, but also because a lot of what can be said about them can also be said about the US.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Britain joined the war in 1939 after Germany had invaded Poland, but a few key things had happened before that. Nazi troops had already marched into Austria and the German-speaking parts of the former Czechoslovakia, with the latter causing a meeting between leaders of some Western European countries in which Hitler signed a peace treaty. Hitler, of course, broke that peace treaty basically right away, showing that he had no intention of maintaining peace and wanted to take control over Eastern Europe. 2 days after the Nazis invaded Poland, the UK declared war on Germany, as it had become clear that Hitler's intentions were to continue expanding their territory on European soil. Now, I want to be clear about this because I know it's easy for ill-intentioned people to take things out of context and not use their brains. It is a good thing the Allied powers won that war. The purpose of this part of the video is to demonstrate that Britain's involvement in the war stemmed more out of fear that Germany would eventually shift the power balance in Europe, which would later cause issues for Britain, one of Europe's foremost superpowers. The British government and Churchill himself had no real issues with the political persecution, the growing fascism throughout Europe, and Hitler himself, until it became clear that through their expansionist policies on European soil, they would eventually become a threat to Britain's position in the world. Churchill himself wrote news articles in British newspapers in 1920, playing into the anti-Semitic notion that there are good Jews and bad Jews, which he paradoxically identified good Jews as nationalist Jews who identified more with the country and the political system they live in instead of their Jewish faith, and also Zionist Jews who wanted to establish a new country in Palestine. In the very same article, he described bad Jews as international Jews and terrorist Jews, or basically anyone who had supported the Russian Revolution, as Bolsheviks who were hell-bent on overthrowing society. I'm going to quote him here at length. "The national Russian Jews, in spite of the disabilities under which they have suffered, have managed to play an honorable role and useful part in the national life even of Russia. As bankers and industrialists, they have strenuously promoted the development of Russia's economic resources, and they were foremost in the creation of these remarkable organizations, the Russian Cooperative Society. In violent opposition to all this sphere of Jewish effort rise the schemes of the international Jews. The adherents of this sinister confederacy are mostly men reared up among the unhappy populations of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. Most, if not all of them, have forsaken the faith of their forefathers and divorced from their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. This movement among the Jews is not new, from the day of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, Bella Kuhn, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman. This worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstruction of society on basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. There is no need to exaggerate the part in the creation of Bolshevism and the actual bringing about of the Russian Revolution by these international and for the most part atheistical Jews. It is certainly a very great one. It probably outweighs all others with the notable exception of Lenin. The majority of the leading figures are Jews. Moreover, the principal inspiration and driving power comes from the Jewish leaders. The same phenomenon has been present in Germany so far as this madness has been allowed to prey upon the temporary prostration of the German people. Although in all these countries there are many non-Jews every bit as bad as the worst of Jewish revolutionaries, the part played by the latter and the proportion to their numbers in the population is astonishing. Yeah, so not only did Churchill hold some pretty anti-Semitic views, but he was also an anti-communist in every sense of the word. In the very same article, Winston gives the example of a good nationalist Jew being a person who identifies with the country over religion and race, and also gives the example of a good Russian Jew as bankers and industrialists. Churchill seemed to be fine with Jewish people as long as they were nationalists above everything else, but if they had other allegiances, say to a political party or the working class, then they were part of a global Jewish-led conspiracy who wanted to overthrow the world. They were only accepted if they were British first and Jewish second. Churchill even had some positive things to say about Hitler, like in 1935 when he admired his long, weary battle for the German heart. The story of that struggle cannot be read without admiration for the courage, the perseverance, and the vital force which enabled him to overcome all the resistances which barred his path. This was said 2 years after the first concentration camp for political opponents was opened, by the way. Now, a lot of people will say it's disingenuous to say that this was Churchill's real opinion on Hitler and that he was just trying to flatter him, and then they'll bring up that there are many quotes of Churchill hating Hitler during and after the war. First I'll say, yeah, no shit, that Churchill hated Hitler during and after the war and that those quotes exist. They had just fought each other in one of the most violent wars in history. But this praise of Hitler, of which there was more than one instance before he was considered a threat to Britain's position in the world, is just as important to show the British establishment's perspective on fascism, as long as it didn't threaten them. Not only is this quote backed up by others that Churchill himself made, but they're also consistent with his opinion on fascist Italy and Mussolini. Italy fell to fascism in 1922 under the control of Benito Mussolini. I'm going to take quotes provided and further sourced information from the International Churchill Foundation, which on their own website describes their mission as celebrating the timeless values of Sir Winston Churchill. ICS will embolden all generations to understand the historical context of his life and defend, enhance, and promote the values he embodied: freedom, democracy, and human rights. On the same page, you can find a list of donors to this organization, a list of American and British CEOs and businessmen, and founded by the man's own son. So, yeah, certainly a completely unbiased source. No, I'm kidding, of course. The ICS exists to whitewash Churchill and make him look better than he was, by basically explaining away any fascist sympathies as just doing what he could against communism. For example, Churchill's complicity in the Bengal famine, which killed more than 3 million Bengalis, is not mentioned once on the entire website. The only mention of the famine at all is in this one article as a passing remark where it's framed as a Marxist conspiracy theory, instead of observable reality, since we have both proof of Churchill himself making racist remarks about Indians and commands made by him and his government to keep producing and exporting food from their colonies, even when it was clear that the increasingly high demands would result in and exacerbate a famine. I mention all of this just to say that even a foundation dedicated to presenting Churchill as some moral authority and a great European hero can't completely ignore his fascist sympathies. In 1927, this is what he had to say about Benito Mussolini and other fascist governments. "If I had been an Italian, I am sure I should have been wholeheartedly with you from the start to finish in your triumphant struggles against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism. Italy has shown that there is a way of fighting the subversive forces which can rally the masses of the people, properly led to value and wish to defend the honor and stability of stabilized society. She has provided the necessary antidote to the Russian poison. Hereafter, no great nation will be unprovided with an ultimate means of protection against the cancerous growth of Bolshevism. I will not pretend that if I had to choose between communism and Nazism, I would choose communism. On top of this praise, another interesting period of history to analyze is Britain's reaction to the Abyssinian crisis. In 1935, Fascist Italy would invade the country of Abyssinia, a still independent East African nation at the time. Britain and France, League of Nations members, responded to this independent country invading another independent country about as weakly as you could, by placing some light sanctions on them. Notably, however, these sanctions didn't include oil, coal, steel, or basically anything that would have caused the British and French governments any major sacrifices. In public, British and French politicians promised to fight for the Abyssinian people, but behind closed doors, foreign ministers negotiated the Horror-Laval Pact, which gave 2/3 of Abyssinia to Italy, leaving only 1/3 of the country to the actual people that lived there. Eventually, the pact would be dropped, and the Italians continued their invasion until they captured Abyssinia, leading Britain and France to drop their sanctions a mere 2 months after the end of the invasion. Britain and France, who literally just a few years ago entered a group dedicated to preserving and upholding world peace, had clearly demonstrated that for all the talk about international law, human rights, and Western values, that these were just words that held no weight or influence, since clearly Britain and France had no actual commitment to upholding them, much like Britain and France of today. In one of the most obvious cases of an invasion that the League was created to prevent, 2 of the most powerful nations signed to the League didn't just fail to prevent another member from carrying out an invasion, but acted more out of concern for their own interests over anything else. As for the United States, they also reacted similarly to fascism, not really reacting to the Abyssinian crisis at all, and ignoring warnings from their ambassador in Germany that Hitler's ultimate goal was to eradicate the entire Jewish population from Europe. Just like the British, the Americans also hated communism and actively worked to stop its expansion, from supporting the counter-revolutionary forces during the Russian Revolution to the numerous wars and massacres carried out during the Cold War. America as well shared a pretty good relationship with Fascist Italy, at least until near their involvement in the war, and to understand how deep the relationship actually went, why so many Christians, conservatives, and business owners supported them, I recommend reading Mussolini and Fascism, The View from America, as a good overview. America's even had their own anti-communism rallies in some of their biggest stadiums as well. So then why did America and British go to war with Germany? Well, it's simple. Germany became the bigger threat. For the British, it came when it was clear that Germany had no intent of negotiating peace and instead wanted to expand their territory on the European mainland. And for the Americans, it became clear that Germany was a bigger military threat that they had originally expected. And rather than deal with a Europe that was completely dominated by a country that was already hostile towards them, they joined the war right after they were attacked by Japan. So, why did I just move away from Germany and talk about Britain and the United States for so long? It's important to understand how Britain and the US felt about fascism before it became a bigger threat than they could handle, because it's precisely these attitudes that allowed Nazis to continue in positions of power after the end of World War II. Fascism was the natural progression of the German state to prevent an uprising against the economic elite like the one that had just happened in Russia. And it was a movement supported by politicians and the same economic elite in the US and Britain, both as a form of providing economic stability, no matter how superficial that stability actually was for the workers of said country, but also as a tool to use against the growth of communism within its working class. Communism was, and still is, considered to be the most dangerous threat to the American, British, and German state, because it directly threatens the power structure that upholds these governments' place in the world. These countries did absolutely everything they could to prevent its growth, including supporting emerging fascist movements as a form of preventing revolution, up until said fascist movements' goals came into more direct conflict with the position of the US and Britain in the world. At a certain point, one has to ask themselves, is fascism an ideology that is just magically born out of socioeconomic conditions, or is it a movement that is consciously supported and propped up by the economic and political elite as a way of crushing growing political ideologies that directly threaten the power structure of these countries? Do you think the Oetkers or the Quants or the Porchepiers or the Fords of this world, or any of the politicians that serviced them and their class interest, who helped finance Hitler's rise to power, who looked the other way every time someone was killed because it was profitable, felt even an iota of what any of the people locked up as political prisoners, or fighting the actual war, or even just civilians felt? No, they didn't, because these people didn't go through a war. This period in history was nothing more than an economic opportunity for them. The Quants specifically not only helped Hitler's rise to power, but once he was in power and the Holocaust was in full swing, even used concentration camp prisoners as free labor in their factories and estates. And today, the Quant family is still among the richest families, not just in Germany, but the world. I'm getting off topic, so we'll get back to German capitalists a little later in this video. World War II would end in 1945. The Nazis were defeated, but fascism was not. A period of so-called denazification would be carried out to help bring Germany away from Nazism, although this denazification process would be carried out differently in different sectors of the newly divided German state. It's easy to erase Nazi publications, tear down monuments, and change laws, but what to do with the millions of Germans who were a part of the Nazi Party? What to do with a society of 60 million people who had by and large stood by and just watched one of the worst human atrocities unfold and do nothing? What to do with the economic elite who hadn't just funded the growth of the Nazi Party, but had even profited off of the war? Different sectors had different solutions. Originally, Germany was separated into 4 different zones, one controlled by the Americans, one by the British, one by the French, and one by the Soviet Union. This would later change as the Cold War caused the Western nations to unify their sectors into one German state, the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, leaving East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, its separate country. And I think it's only fair to focus on each of these 2 countries and their denazification process separately. Let's start with the East. East Germany's new government was under the control of the Soviet Union and the SAD, a communist party. Now, the Soviet Union was a lot harsher on Nazis in the East for a number of reasons. Nazis were a big part of the anti-communist sentiment in Europe, so it should be obvious that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were more ideologically and economically opposed. Not only this, but the unique brutality of the Nazis throughout its military campaigns in the East compared to the West, coupled on with the 27 million casualties by the Soviet Union suffered, the highest amount of military and civilian deaths during the war by far, made denazification in the Soviet zone a much higher priority. Not only were Nazis more harshly punished in the Soviet sector, but victims of Nazi crimes within the newly formed state were given compensation. In East Germany, 12,890 Nazis were found to be guilty, a number almost twice as much as the West German conviction rate, despite East Germany having a population 2.5 times less than that of West Germany. On top of this, the punishment for being found guilty was much harsher in East Germany, and Nazis were 6 to 7 times more likely to be prosecuted for Nazi-related crimes in East Germany than the West. Some Nazis even fled from the East to the West because they knew that they would be treated better on the other side. An anecdote from the book Reckonings by Mary Fulbrook, which I've been citing throughout this part of the video, includes something that can be analogous for this situation. The case of a Nazi party member who was tried and convicted in the East, but that same party member's superior, who was also tried in the West, got off with essentially a slap on the wrist. Now, make no mistake, East Germany and the Soviet Union were not perfect in their denazification efforts. There were certainly Nazis reintegrated into the Stasi and other parts of the state. But outside of that, I'd even go as far as to say that they were too sure of themselves in that regard, and that this prevented them from being as thorough as they should have been. But the comparison to West Germany and their treatment of Nazis doesn't even come close. The end of World War II marked the end of a major conflict, but also the beginning of the next one, the Cold War. The newly formed West German state was considered to be an important ally against the growth of communism and the Soviet Union, which in turn affected how the Western occupying powers dealt with Nazis in positions of power, the most dedicated anti-communists Germany has to offer. Whenever denazification is talked about in German society, everyone was and still is aware that some Nazis managed to escape punishment, and some even, somehow, magically, and certainly not on purpose, found their way into the new German government and its institutions. but that regardless, the West Germans tried their honest best to denazify. This is a deliberate presentation of this period in German history to stifle conversation, so let's talk about to what extent the West German state reintegrated Nazis into its political structures, and for what purpose. From 1945 to 1946, the Nuremberg trials were underway, where 24 of the most important political and military leaders of Germany were tried for their various crimes. Germans at the time were, for the most part, okay with this, but the thing is, World War II and the Holocaust was not carried out by solely 24 men. During West Germany's occupation by the American military, a poll carried out found that nearly half of Germans thought that National Socialism was a good idea that was badly carried out. After 2 years of occupation, the number of Germans who thought this way would continue rising. The statement, "the extermination of the Jews and Poles and other non-Aryans was not necessary for the security of Germans," was asked as well, to which 37% of Germans in the American sector disagreed. This same report ends stating, "Substantial numbers of Germans continue to subscribe to sentiments closely tied up with Nazi ideology as well, of course, as with other racist and reactionary ideologies. And not only did they refuse to accept responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi era, but they objected when denazification boards levied stiff penalties upon the lesser supporters of the NSDAP. Most Germans didn't see themselves as guilty of what happened, seeing themselves only as followers who had been tricked and putting the complete blame on a select few politicians. Germans again saw themselves as the victims." The Law for the Liberation from National Socialism and Militarism was passed in 1946, which handed over the responsibilities for denazification over to the German authorities. In 1949, the West German government would be established, and Konrad Adenauer would be elected as the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. At the time of the elections, there was already consensus among parties that they would end denazification almost immediately. Adenauer was a part of the CDU, a right-wing Christian Democratic Party. The CDU had a coalition with the FDP, a liberal party, and the Deutsche Partei, or German Party, a nationalist conservative party. I think this quote from German party member Franz Richter sums up these groups' attitudes quite well. "We are in favor of ending Nazification and denazification, firstly because, in our opinion, political conviction as such should not be punished. Secondly, we are in favor of ending denazification because of the problematic nature of the process, which is recognized by all sides. Thirdly, we are in favor of ending denazification because we do not pay lip service to the fact that a real chance must be given to those who have been seduced, who numbered in the millions, and who are not willing to forego in the rebuilding of the German fatherland." Keep that "political convictions should not be punished" line in the back of your head, because it's going to sound really hypocritical soon. In 1950, the Bundestag passed new guidelines for denazification that included focusing exclusively on the worst of leaders of the party while ignoring other members, followers, and higher-ups. All restrictions placed on those convicted of belonging to the Nazi Party, with the exception of its highest-ranking officers and officials, would be removed. Fines and penalties would be forgiven, and labor camp and prison sentences would be amnestied. Of the Nazis who were released from prison, some of their crimes had been so severe they had gotten life sentences. I'll get into specific Nazis and what they ended up doing a little bit later in the video, but for now, I'll leave it at this quote from the British High Commissioner from 1951 to 1953, Sir Yvonne Kirkpatrick. "Whenever I traveled, I ran into ghosts of Hitler's Reich, men who had occupied positions in administration, in industry, or the society of the day. They were either living in retirement or were taking jobs in banks, commerce, or industry." Not only was the denazification process to be ended almost right after it began, but of the denazification that already took place, it was considered to have been too severe and needed to be reversed by some of the most widely supported political parties. This meant suspending fines up to a certain amount, allowing lower-level Nazi officials and soldiers out, and allowing them to work in the public sector again. In the book The Wehrmacht, written by German military historian Wolfram Wett, he describes an event that happened in the early 50s that he considered to be an accurate depiction of social attitudes in Germany at the time. The Nazi Wilhelm Kapp, convicted in court for murdering a prisoner of war, escaped his imprisonment and found refuge in a town in Saxony. Upon discovering this, a local city councilman reported him to the police. In response, the people in the town physically assaulted him, sent him death threats, and eventually he was even removed from office, with no objections or condemnations from the German press. So, if the Federal Republic of Germany wasn't interested in denazification, what were they interested in? In September of 1950, Konrad Adenauer would address the nation with this statement: "You will soon hear a cabinet decision that we made this morning and which aims to remove all supporters of communism from the offices of the Federal Republic, whether they work as workers, employees, or civil servants, to be removed ruthlessly." What would follow is the Decree Against Enemies of the Constitution, which identified 11 communist organizations and 2 right-wing extremist ones as such. Shortly after, the KPD, or the German Communist Party, founded by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht back in the 1910s, would be banned, the last time Germany has ever banned a political party. By the afternoon, 199 party offices were searched and closed, printing plans confiscated, propaganda material confiscated, newspapers banned, party assets confiscated, and officials arrested. Max Reimann, the KPD official, and other leading cadres who have already fled to the GDR to avoid arrest. KPD members who remain in the Federal Republic also have to fear financial sanctions. For example, Heinz Renner, who, like Reimann, was involved in the drafting of the Basic Law as a member of the Parliamentary Council, has his pension as a Nazi victim retroactively revoked because of his membership in the KPD. An important policy for Adenauer and his campaign was the rearmament of West Germany. Communists and other leftists were already being silenced and arrested, so it was quite easy for Adenauer and the CDU to accuse anyone against the rearmament of being a secret communist to silence them. The rearmament would come quickly, and soon West Germany would be one of the most important parts of NATO's military alliance on the Eastern Front, and one of the United States' closest military and political allies. The United States in particular would have a big hand in West Germany's political development, in more obvious ways like funding military alliances and just vocal support, but also through privately funded organizations that aim at influencing political institutions, such as the Atlantikbrücke. On Google, Atlantikbrücke is described as a leading private non-profit association to promote German-American understanding and Atlanticism. The association organizes invitation-only conferences, seminars, and colloquia. In these meetings, all sorts of different elites are invited to meet, from industrialists, politicians, military officers, representatives of multinational corporations, and media officials. On the board of Atlantikbrücke right now are members of the CDU, the SPD, Green Party, and Free Democrats, although some of these parties have had members on the board since the beginning. Helmut Schmidt, a former chancellor of the Federal Republic himself, was one of the founders of the Atlantikbrücke and also a former Nazi. Since the organization and its meetings are invite-only, it exists as a private and direct link between Germany's unelected economic elite, its politicians, and its media officials, with driving forces guiding the organization in finance, multinational corporations, ruling political circles, and the media. I also wanted to mention this isn't like some top secret organization or anything either. There are many organizations like Atlantikbrücke, not just in Germany, but in the entire world. Those with more money and more power will always have more influence or more ability to influence politicians because at the end of the day, if said politician isn't already a wealthy business owner, investor, or banker, then that's who has the ability to fund their political career. Now that we have some idea how the new German government was set up, we can actually look at where former Nazis and collaborators ended up within the new German state and Europe. We already talked about Helmut Schmidt, who was an elected chancellor with a Nazi past, but he wasn't the only one. Kurt-Georg Kiesinger, another CDU party member, was also a chancellor of Germany and a former Nazi. Hans Globke, a lawyer who worked closely with the Nazi Party to write the race laws that would soon condemn millions to death, was Konrad Adenauer's political partner. Erich von Manstein was a convicted war criminal who was released from prison to serve as an advisor to the federal government. Adolf Heusinger would earn a promotion from the highest command authority in the Wehrmacht to the obvious next step as the chairman of the NATO Military Committee. And I'm gonna repeat myself so it's understood. A Nazi who personally worked with Adolf Hitler as a military aide became the top commander of all of NATO. Franz Schönhuber, a right-wing activist that was openly proud of his past in the SS, was the head of the Republikanerpartei, a party that got over 2 million votes as late as 1989. Walter Hallstein, a soldier in the Wehrmacht and a member of not one, not two, but 5 Nazi organizations, was one of the founders of the EU and the first president of the Commission of the European Economic Community. In 1965, the Brown Book would be published by East German historian Albert Norden. This book would accuse hundreds of high-ranking German officials and officers of having a Nazi past. The West German government would claim that the entire book was a lie and just communist propaganda. And I just want to point out here, if you keep calling things that are verifiably correct communist propaganda, what do you think that says about communists? The book correctly identified 1,800 West Germans with Nazi pasts that hold influence over the economic, political, or social apparatuses of West Germany, including 15 ministers and state secretaries, 100 admirals and generals, 828 judges or state lawyers and high law officers, 245 officials of the Foreign Office and of embassies and consulates in leading positions, and 297 high police officers and officers of the Verfassungsschutz. You'd think maybe this would cause some people to rethink the direction the government was going, but no. Although West Germany was criticized, both they and their partners shrugged, and business continued as usual. In 2016, Germany's Ministry of Justice decided to investigate itself and would discover even more Nazis than previously thought. Of the 170 lawyers who held senior positions in the ministry between 1949 and 1973, 90 had been members of the Nazi Party and 34 had been members of the SA. More than 15% had even worked in the Nazi Reich Ministry of Justice before 1945. These figures highlight why the prosecution of Nazi crimes was impeded for so long. The suffering of the victims was ignored far too long, and many groups of victims, such as homosexuals or Sinti and Roma, suffered renewed discrimination in the Federal Republic of Germany. Most heads and deputy heads of directorates, generals, and many heads of division at the Federal Ministry of Justice in the 1950s and 1960s had a Nazi past that was pertinent in this context. Directly after the war, while arrested by American forces, Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, Leo Dietrich Franz Reichsfreier Geyer von Schweppenberg, and Heinz Guderian are recorded while having a conversation, where Heinz Guderian states that the fundamental principles of Nazism are fine. Wilhelm, a convicted war criminal, served his tiny sentence and died in his home in Bavaria. Leo, a German general, was released from captivity only to be asked to help rebuild the new German army and later even work in the US military. Heinz, another German general, and the one the quote above is attributed to, was also released from prison where he spent the rest of his days writing military memoirs and Nazi propaganda. Franz Halde, Felix Schleine, Paul Heusse, Herbert Gill, and Otto Kuhm, all former Nazis, were all so willing to write propaganda, in fact, that the CIA even hired them to continue writing anti-communist propaganda, all while downplaying the severity of Nazi crimes. But hey, why did the CIA go out and hire Nazis to work for them? Well, virtually everyone nowadays knows about Operation Paperclip, a formerly secret US program that took over 1,000 of Nazi engineers, scientists, and technicians to work within different American government agencies, but most famously NASA. But what few people know is how deep Nazis were involved with other organizations like the CIA and NATO. Walter Rauff, a Nazi commander and one of the people responsible for engineering the gas chambers, would not even be brought to trial, instead being employed by the likes of the West German government, the CIA, the Mossad, or the Israeli Secret Service, and even go all the way to South America to be an advisor to the fascist dictator of Chile, Augusto Pinochet. This wouldn't be the last time the CIA worked with Nazis to meddle in Latin American politics either, as they, along with the Bolivian government, would use the head of the Gestapo in Lyon and renowned torturer of prisoners, Klaus Barbie, to hunt down and kill Che Guevara. Otto von Bolschwing, an early member of the Nazi Party that became deputy of Heinrich Himmler in the Reich Main Security Office, as well as later deputy to the chief logistician of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann, was hired by the CIA in 1950 after a few years of working in the West German government. After he had been hired by the CIA, the Austrian government asked the Americans to investigate his past. The request was sent out to the Berlin Document Center to conduct an investigation which immediately identified von Bolschwing as a committed Nazi. They would send their information onto the CIA, who would respond by asking them either to withhold Bolschwing's file from the Austrian government or to produce a negative file. In response, Peter Sichel, an employee at the Document Center in Berlin, would respond. The person you are dealing with is so well known and their background so well publicized in the past that I deem it improbable that you can protect them from their past history. This was ignored, of course, and von Bolschwing and his family would go on to live in Sacramento as full U.S. citizens. Emil Ausberg, a Nazi officer who was directly involved in the planning of the final solution, was employed by the CIA as an expert of Soviet affairs. I think one eventually has to ask themselves, isn't it strange that so many Nazis were hired for the very same skills and convictions that made them Nazis to continue doing the same things that they were doing as Nazis in the West German government and the CIA? What does that say about these institutions? What does it say about their goals? The director of Justice Department's Official of Special Investigations, Eli Rosenbaum, said, "The real winners of the Cold War were Nazi war criminals." So, if Nazi soldiers and officials didn't get punished, what happened to the industrialists and the capitalists who supported and funded their rise? Well, basically nothing. They, like other Germans, were seen as just followers who had no other option. But unlike other Germans, their support for the Nazi Party was much more impactful. We talked earlier about how industrialists financially supported the rise of the Nazis because it erased discussions of class. Not only did they do this, but the Nazis were focused on the rearmament of Germany. That meant a lot of lucrative deals for prominent industrialists. As Jewish people were slowly erased from public life, who do you think took over their businesses? German men were busy fighting a war. Who do you think worked in the factories? The Quants, who produced batteries and helped build concentration camps, used thousands of unpaid concentration camp prisoners, all of which was really lucrative for them. Günter Quandt, the head at the time, was actually interned at first because he had so many links to Goebbels, but he was judged as a Mitläufer or follower and freed. Rudolf August Oetker, a prominent food manufacturer, even to this day, you literally cannot go into a German market or Späti without seeing a Dr. Oetker pizza somewhere, and August von Fink, founder of the insurance company Allianz, both prominent supporters and financiers of the Nazi Party, didn't pay anything and kept the wealth that they made. Friedrich Flick, one of the Third Reich's largest arm producers, Aryanizers, and exploiters of forced and slave labor through his steel, coal, and machinery conglomerate, was one of the few people actually convicted for their participation in Nazi crimes, but received a measly 7-year sentence. 7 years he didn't even serve. He, like all of the other industrialists who profited from the Holocaust, didn't lose their business, the profit they made using slave labor, or suffer any serious consequences. In fact, he went on to briefly become the richest person in West Germany. The Bayer company, part of IG Farben, well known for making aspirin and other medicines, not only engineered and produced Zyklon B, the gas used to kill people in concentration camps, but also used prisoners of the camps to test new drugs on. Today, they are still one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world and had an annual revenue over 50 billion last year. But hey, they are capitalists. It is more profitable to engineer weapons for governments than it is to make medicine for people who desperately need it. Albert Reimann, creator of investment firm Jab Holding, who has invested in all sorts of companies from Dr. Pepper, Panera Bread, and other consumer goods, was a devoted Nazi who sexually abused, tortured, and humiliated slave workers in his businesses during World War II. That family is worth 33 billion today, partly off of money they made using slaves. Siemens, Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler-Benz, Dr. Oetker, Porsche, Krupp, IG Farben, Allianz, throw a rock in a room of German industrialists and billionaires, and you have a pretty good chance of hitting a Nazi or someone connected to Nazis. I should stress, though, that none of these families became rich because of the Nazis. They were already rich before the Nazis came along. They simply followed along with what was in their best class interest, which is always, even today, to 1. Crush any opposition to the economic structure that keeps them rich, and 2. To maximize profit. Having a steady stream of slaves who work for free and a government who is always demanding more weapons, vehicles, and other manufactured goods used for never-ending war will certainly maximize profit. I mean, look at arms manufacturers in the United States today. Now, I know at this point it can all feel quite bleak. So many Nazis and Nazi collaborators who not only escaped justice, but were aided by the German and American government to either live out the rest of their lives peacefully, or literally continue what they were doing as a Nazi in the new government. I know it all seems unbearably cruel, and some of you may even be asking yourselves, can it get worse? Can it actually get worse than literally thousands of Nazis, some even convicted of murder and war crimes in court, escaping justice and continuing to do the same jobs they had been doing under Hitler, but this time while building up the new German state? Well, yeah, it can actually. Up until the end of the war, for most of his adult life, Reinhard Gehlen had served as a Nazi. He was a first general staff officer of an infantry that took part in the invasion of Poland, the attack that started World War II. He was head of the East Group of the Operations Department of the Army General Staff, he was involved in the planning of Operation Barbarossa, and he was head of the Foreign Armies East Department. Basically, he was a really committed Nazi that was regarded as a master spy and communist hunter. The historian Christopher Simpson writes, Gehlen derived much of his information from his role in one of the most terrible atrocities of the war, the torture, interrogation, and murder by starvation of some 4 million Soviet prisoners of war. After Germany's defeat, he was captured by American forces where he offered up his services in exchange for his freedom. Basically a win-win deal for him either way, as he'd effectively continue doing what he was already doing during the war. The Americans agreed, and in 1946, Gehlen, along with 350 former German intelligence agents, were released from captivity and sent to Munich to start an organization focused on spying and collecting intelligence on the East, set up a year before the Cold War would even officially start. This organization, dubbed Organisation Gehlen, would become America's eyes and ears in a part of the world that they couldn't reach on their own, and would be supported by $250 million of US tax money and 4,000 full-time employees. Since it was a major source of intel on the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries, Gehlen and the organization held considerable influence over the US and other European countries' policies towards the East. The organization wouldn't just work closely with the CIA and the US either, as they became close allies and supporters of NATO as well, with 2/3 of the raw intelligence NATO had on Warsaw Pact countries coming directly from them. Members of the organization would also work on CIA propaganda projects like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Organisation Gehlen, along with the CIA, would provide support for pro-Nazi movements in Hungary and helped instigate violent conflicts within the country. In 1988, the CIA would release documents detailing its relationship with Gehlen and its organization. 18,000 pages worth of documents, mind you. In them, Gehlen, who again was involved with the intentional starvation of 4 million prisoners of war, was described as honest and idealist, enjoys good food and wine, unprejudiced mind. So, who did this unprejudiced mind choose to help him build up his spying organization? Well, we've previously talked about Otto von Bolschwing, Klaus Barbie, and Emil Augsburg, who were all members of the organization, but the list also includes Nazis such as Hans Sömer, a Nazi who had burned down 7 synagogues in Paris, SS Staatenführer Willy Krischbaum, a Gestapo leader in southeastern Europe, SS Sturmbahnführer Fritz Schmidt, the Gestapo chief in Kiel, Alois Brunner, an SS officer who worked on the planning of the Holocaust, Eberhard Taubert, a Nazi propagandist who worked closely with Goebbels, and Franz Six, an SS Staatenführer who was directly involved with the execution of 144 people in the Smolensk ghetto, among many, many, many more. Now, this all may seem bad enough on its own, but in 1956, Organisation Gehlen would be reassigned to the West German government. But Organisation Gehlen sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? Plus it has that famous Nazi's name in the title. It's probably better to call it something like Bundesnachrichtendienst. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Bundesnachrichtendienst still exists. Not only does it still exist, but it's the Federal Intelligence Service of Germany, and they still, to an extent, report to the US and the NSA. They've been involved in several other controversies, but I think that's better to get into when talking about post-reunification Germany. For now, I think that it's a good point to end on, that the Federal Intelligence Agency of the German state wasn't just staffed by Nazis, but created and facilitated specifically for them by the USA to continue doing a PG-13 version of what they had already been doing under Hitler. I know we just talked at length about how Nazis were purposely reintegrated into the new German social and political systems, but surely it can't be all bad, I hear you ask. Some Nazis must have gotten what they deserved. Surely the German government prosecuted some Nazis. Someone had to have been held responsible, right? Remember how I said in East Germany over 12,000 people were convicted for Nazi crimes, despite their population being much, much smaller than the Federal Republic? In the Federal Republic of Germany, only 6,656 people were ever convicted of Nazi crimes, despite charges being brought against over 100,000 people. I'm going to end this section with an extended quote from Professor of German History Mary Fulbrook. Perhaps 200,000 people, and possibly closer to 1 million, were at one point or another actively involved in killing Jewish civilians, and the ranks of those who made this possible were far wider. The vast majority of sentences, just under 5,000, were relatively lenient, with terms of imprisonment of up to 2 years. Of those perpetrators actually brought to court in the Federal Republic of Germany before the end of the 20th century, only 164 individuals were eventually sentenced as perpetrators of murder, rather than for lesser crimes. In view of the hundreds of thousands of individuals who had been involved in the machinery of mass murder and the 6 million people who had died in what we now call the Holocaust, 164 convictions for murder is not an impressive total. The total number of persons convicted under the Federal Republic for Nazi crimes was in itself fewer even than the number of people who had been employed at Auschwitz alone. Now, I can already hear people saying that I'm being overly harsh of West Germany while not putting the same amount of effort into an analysis about East German denazification. And that's true, but there's actually a reason for it, and it has to do with the reunification. Some people have the idea that the current Germany that exists today is a separate thing from West and East Germany, or something that came after it, but that's not really true. The German state that exists today is the same government and institutions as West Germany. During reunification, East Germany ceased to exist and the West German state began to govern over all of Germany. Even if East Germany had Nazis integrated into its political institutions at a rate comparable to West Germany, it wouldn't really matter if we're talking about Nazis in Germany today. Its institutions don't exist anymore. Everything that controls Germany today is an extension of the West German political system. And although Germany is one country today, East Germany is still visibly, different. For example, West Germans have more disposable income than East Germans still, while East Germans have a higher unemployment rate than the West, and other things like that. I was originally going to go into the social and economic differences between these two groups, how they came to be, and why they persist, but I quickly understood that I was going to have to get way off topic, and this video is already long enough. So maybe I'll come back to it in a different video. Anyway, the Germans had one state again, and there aren't any more Nazis in the government, at least not any open ones, so mission accomplished, I guess? No, I'm kidding, of course. Keeping Nazis in your government, your school, and in public life will have its effects on a society. It's a good thing that German kids are taught about their history and that genocide is bad. It's more than some other countries have done, but that's not all the Nazis did though, is it? And Nazis targeted other Europeans, which was clearly a big no-no for, Europeans. But what if the Nazis had hypothetically done a genocide towards some other foreign group? Would it be less bad? What if the Nazis had decided to invade a North African country and find their Lebensraum there like Mussolini did? And what about all the stuff before the genocide? Hitler didn't run on a pro-genocide platform. What did he say before? Who helped him get into power? Why did it happen? It would be nice for them to include that stuff too. History is good, but it does fuck all if we can't learn from it. So, let's investigate. Now, I'm going to start with more obvious behavior like hate crime statistics and organizations and slowly transition to German institutions and then just German society as a whole, so stick with me on this one. On August 22nd, 1992, thousands of protesters, many of them neo-Nazis and right-wing extremists, gathered around a center for asylum seekers in Rostock, Germany. The number of migrants arriving in Germany had reached an all-time high, and Germans were coming together to vent their frustrations. The crowd of rioters started throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails through the windows while shouting slogans like "Germany is for Germans, foreigners out." The riots would take 4 nights to die down, spreading to nearby buildings as well, and again bringing back this version of another Germany to the front of newspapers. For a while, at least. The images that came out that night were shocking, and the event would come to be known as the Rostock-Lichtenhagen riots. Politicians across Germany and thus public reactions were mixed, with some left-wing or liberal politicians calling it what it is, a racist pogrom, while other politicians from prominent parties like the CDU blamed the events on left-wing radicals and the Stasi. This event and its subsequent reaction would be one of the first major scandals that would hit the new unified German state, and many more have followed. As Germany continues to develop, unsurprising trends have emerged. For example, the rate of hate crimes has been rising consistently every year, with the vast majority of them being racist and xenophobic attacks, followed by anti-Semitic and anti-LGBTQ attacks. The biggest and most common cause of these attacks is, unsurprisingly, right-wing political violence, with 3 out of 4 hate crimes motivated by far-right ideology. Although this may seem bad on the surface, if we keep digging, the reality is far worse. An estimated 9 out of 10 victims of hate crimes don't report the incident to the police, not just in Germany, but across the EU. While it might seem crazy to not report a crime happening to you, there's actually quite a good reason many people don't. In a briefing paper published by Human Rights Watch about hate crimes in Germany, a specific incident is noted where a Cameroonian man who has lived in Berlin for 8 years was assaulted by 3 Ukrainian men that left him in a hospital for 5 days. When questioned by Human Rights Watch, the man described the incident. The first statement of the investigator was, "Why did you not call the ambulance but the police?" The second question was to ask for my ID. The third is if they should call an ambulance. Only later they asked me a brief question on what happened. 2 of the 3 men were arrested on the spot. The men didn't have a registered address in Germany, so once they were released, nothing came of it. Another incident cited in the report, that of a man from the Central African Republic and a Saudi refugee being attacked outside of a club, reads as follows. The 2 police officers took us out of the group, around us, which was still there when the police arrived and was also still screaming. They did not ask anybody anything. They put us in their car and drove us away. When we asked them why they did not question any of the people present, they told us to be quiet. When we continued to ask them about this, one of them said, "What do you want? I saved your ass. I could have left you there." Other incidents that prevent people from filing police reports cited in the report include police collecting personal data from victims at a crime scene when the alleged perpetrator was standing in earshot, failing to escort victims home late at night after attacks have taken place, and including the home address of the victim in the case file, where it can be obtained by the defense or mentioned aloud in trial when a case comes to court, despite legal provisions that permit contact details of lawyers or a victim support organization to be provided instead. Another reason, and probably the most significant, is the fact that immigrants and refugees, especially those coming from the global south, are the largest demographic of hate crime victims and don't really want to talk to German police officers, legal immigrants or otherwise. And honestly, can't really blame them. Despite the non-stop police propaganda posters all over Germany, the German police still have a reputation for being at best unhelpful and at worst racist and violent. But besides normal police issues, the German police also have a nasty habit of being linked to right-wing extremist activities and other hate crimes. For example, here are various instances of police officers around Germany being caught in a right-wing group chat making anti-Semitic and racist jokes. I'm going to share a few of those messages here, but be warned, they're very cruel. The messages you're about to see were sent in a group chat of police officers in Frankfurt and upon discovery were investigated by none other than the Frankfurt police. Nobody involved was charged, of course, because the messages were deemed to be satire and protected under artistic freedom. So let's see what the German police find to be so funny. Here's some police officers sending happy birthday messages on the 20th of April, Hitler's birthday. Here's a meme calling Hitler a hero. Here's a couple anti-Semitic memes about the Holocaust. Here's a couple where they call black people and other migrants the N-word. The image of a Syrian child who drowned to death with his family while coming to Europe was sent as a meme 15 times in this group chat. Here's a meme about Norwegian right-wing extremist Anders Breivik who killed 69 kids at a youth summer camp on Utoya. Here's an officer saying that all asylum seekers should be greeted by the military. Here's some German officers talking about desecrating a corpse while it's still warm after someone sent a picture of a dead woman. Here's a couple messages from police officers talking about raping people. That these quote-unquote jokes were excused as satire and that these police officers were allowed to keep their jobs is unbelievable. But what's worse than that is when officers stop joking and actually start doing things. Like in the case of Uri Jallo, an asylum seeker from Guinea who was found burned to death in his cell with his arms and legs tied to a mattress. This was after he was tortured, of course, receiving a broken nose, a broken rib, and a skull fracture before being lit on fire. On top of his arms and legs being tied to a mattress and no lighter being found in his cell, the German police did their best to investigate, but ended up ruling it a suicide. Or the case of Rubel Vossam, a young Muslim man who was found dying in his cell with injuries described as attack injuries in his autopsy, whose death was also ruled a suicide. Or Ahmad Ahmad, who was wrongfully imprisoned for 2 months and found burned to death in his cell, but only after the relevant data was deleted from the police and prison system, which was also curiously ruled a suicide. So many strange coincidences, crazy how it just keeps happening. But the police isn't the only part of the German state that is infested with right-wing extremists. We previously talked about Organisation Gehlen, which became the Bundesnachrichtendienst, but there are more than just two German government organizations linked with right-wing extremism, like for example the Verfassungsschutz, or the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution. Now, the Verfassungsschutz does basically what it says in its name. It protects the Constitution of Germany from domestic threats. But I gotta be honest, they seem to be a lot more interested in Muslims and left-wing extremists than anything else. Take this 2022 report about the year and pay attention to the language they use. Despite their own report stating that right-wing extremism has increased in every conceivable category, from membership to organizations to physical violence to xenophobic attacks, the Verfassungsschutz described right-wing extremists as follows. Right-wing extremists continue to pursue the goal of gaining acceptance among mainstream democratic groups. I'm sorry, but that's quite a rosy description for a group of people going out and committing violent hate crimes. And despite it being specifically right-wing extremists committing 3 out of every 4 hate crimes in Germany, this is how the same report describes left-wing extremists. Left-wing extremists seek to do away with the existing state and social order, and therefore the free and democratic constitutional system. If we keep reading the actual report, it states that both left-wing criminal activity and left-wing violence fell around 37 and 39% respectively in that year. Actually, if you look at what the Verfassungsschutz counts as left-wing extremism, the vast majority of these crimes are property damage. Nonetheless, the report just has to make sure you know how violent these damn leftists are by stating 1 attempted homicide and 164 cases of bodily injury clearly show that left-wing extremists still have a high propensity for violence. That is compared to the 800 cases of assault caused by right-wing extremists in the same report. Now, if we move to the part of the report labeled Islamist extremists/terrorism, we can see that it also dropped about 3% since the previous year. In fact, the report states very clearly, in 2022, Germany did not see any attacks that could be clearly defined as being motivated by Islamist extremism. This development is similar across Europe. So, knowing this, one has to ask themselves, why is so much space on this report, almost 2 times as much actually, dedicated to 2 forms of terrorism that 1, didn't even happen for an entire year, and 2, was more focused on property damage than harming actual human beings? Why does the report specifically make note of how violent left-wing extremists are for 1 attempted homicide and how they are a threat to the democratic system when right-wing extremists who have been increasing their violence and terrorism consistently, year by year, are described as pursuing the goal of gaining social acceptance? I'll let you ponder those questions yourself. But besides recording statistics, what does the Verfassungsschutz actually do? In November 2011, Uwe Mundlos and Uwe Bernhardt were found dead in their motorhome from a suspected murder-suicide after being discovered robbing a bank. Shortly after, their apartment was set on fire, and their roommate and close friend, Beate Scheppe, turned herself in for arson. Searching through their belongings, the police found a pistol that had been connected to a series of murders through Germany, as well as a DVD containing footage of murder victims. This was the discovery of the NSU, the National Socialist Underground, a secret neo-Nazi terrorist organization that had been committing racially motivated murders and bombings since the year 2000. But the more people dug into the NSU and how these people were able to escape justice for so long revealed a lot of connections to the Verfassungsschutz. For example, the Verfassungsschutz had been recruiting, let's call them informants, in the far-right scene for years. But that only really works if you hire people who actually want to work with you, and not the organizers of right-wing extremist activities who now feel like they can act with impunity because the Verfassungsschutz will make sure their informants don't go to prison. Like, for example, the instance of an informant working in the FAP, a neo-Nazi party who was told beforehand that the party would soon be banned, which allowed them to shred 2 garbage bags full of evidence. The informant's father says he's been long astonished how well informed his son was about police and judicial activities. During the trial against Beate Scheppe for her connection to the murders, it came out that not only were the Verfassungsschutz paid informants aware of the murders taking place and said nothing, but that in reality this money that was being paid out to them did more to support right-wing terrorism, including building up the NSU itself, than combat it. On top of indirectly paying neo-Nazis, sometimes the Verfassungsschutz is aware of right-wing extremists and just chooses to do nothing, like in the case of the NSU, where all 3 members were known to the Verfassungsschutz as right-wing extremists since at least the 90s. Another thing the Verfassungsschutz did was to destroy all documents relevant to the NSU immediately after it was discovered. Yeah, all things that scream innocent. So, to recap, first, they're aware of the people doing the killings as right-wing extremists. Then they work with informants who are involved with the NSU. They pay these informants money that the informants then use to build up the NSU, and then once the NSU is discovered, they destroy all relevant information. I mean, the only thing that would be more incriminating than that is, I don't know, having a member of the Verfassungsschutz actually being at one of the murder scenes. This man here is named Andreas Temm. Andreas Temm openly held far-right political views and was nicknamed Little Adolf by those who knew him in his hometown. Even though these two things were known by the Verfassungsschutz, he still worked there. In 2006, 21-year-old Halit Yozgat was murdered in an internet cafe by one of the three members of the NSU. Interestingly though, Little Adolf, protector of the German constitution, was present during the murder. Originally, he claimed that he had left the cafe shortly before, but after witnesses claimed they saw him there at the time of the murder, he changed his story to him actually being there but not seeing or hearing anything. After his apartment was raided, officials found both weapons and copies of Mein Kampf, as well as other racist propaganda. He kept insisting he had nothing to do with it, that he wasn't aware anything was happening, and eventually nothing came of it. Strange how so many coincidences keep piling up and nothing ever seems to happen. And when there are never any consequences, it signals to people that they can keep doing it. Like for example in this case, where police officers sent each other messages with the tag NSU 2.0 just a few years ago. Who knows though, maybe it's just another one of those jokes that only the type of people who would be police officers in a country like Germany would get. I also want to emphasize, since I don't know how aware English-speaking people are of German politics, this isn't like a secret or anything. This was a huge scandal. That German taxes go to institutions that protect, destroy information relevant to, and give money to neo-Nazi groups, that is well known by most Germans. It's present on signs at demonstrations, it's talked about on German news shows. For example, this NSU talk, as well as the previous right-wing police group chat, were discussed on the ZDF magazine Royale show. It's even present in the lyrics of popular German songs. Now, I want to take a break from the NSU and talk about the people that they actually killed, as people. A sign of basic human empathy that neither the German media, police, or public could afford. Enver Şimşek was a 38-year-old man who owned a flower shop, filling in for a shift for an employee who was on holiday when he was shot in the face. Abdurrahim Ojdogru was working as a machinist in a tailor shop who was shot 2 times in the head. Süleyman Taşköprü, the owner of a local grocery store, was shot in the head 3 times. Habir Kilic, another owner of a local grocery shop, was similarly murdered in his own store. Mehmet Turgut was visiting Rostock to meet up with an acquaintance to open up a kebab store when he was shot in the head. Ismail Yashar, a 50-year-old man who owned a kebab shop, was shot 5 times at 10 in the morning. Theodoros Bourgaridis, a locksmith, was killed in front of his shop. Mehmet Kubashek, a kiosk owner, was murdered inside his home, also by being shot in the head. Halit Yozgat was found murdered inside an internet cafe. He was only 21 years old. Michelle Kieswetter was a policewoman who was shot dead in her vehicle. Now, the last murder, that of a white German policewoman, is suspected to be because of personal reasons, as she and the NSU members grew up in the same area. But the other 9 people were all from immigrant backgrounds, 8 of them Turkish and 1 Greek. The murders had all been linked to one another by the specific gun that was used to kill them, a rare pistol from the former Czechoslovakia. Now, if you were a police officer and you had just received word that 9 people of immigrant backgrounds had just been murdered, what would your first thought be? Nazis, right-wing extremists, something of that sort? I mean, the identity of the victims is not a confirmation, but it's certainly a starting point. Yeah, not in Germany. Until the discovery of the NSU, the German police repeatedly denied that there was any racist motivation behind these killings, instead choosing to investigate the family members of the victims because they believed that the victims had been murdered for associating with the drug trade and the Turkish mafia, despite there being absolutely no evidence that this was the case, and eyewitnesses to the murders even saying that the perpetrators looked German. This framing of the murders allowed for the police to mistreat the family members of the victims, like in the case of Theodoros Bourgaridis, the only Greek victim, whose wife was lied to by the police that he had a secret mistress in an attempt to get her to confess to her non-existent involvement in the murder. His daughter was also repeatedly asked if her father had ever sexually abused her. The son of the first victor, Enver Şimşek, had this to say about the investigation into his father's murder. First, my mother was accused, then my uncle, then everyone around us was constantly under investigation. That went on for 11 years. My father wasn't treated like he was the victim. Instead, he got the blame. It was the whole of the media, whether it was the so-called kebab murders of Turkish people or drug offenses. The press always said my father was to blame. That term he uses, kebab murders or döner murders or anything similar to that, is how this murder spree was referred to in the German media, despite only 2 of the 10 victims working in a kebab shop. Now, I'm sorry, but this is not serious reporting. If a man committed a murder spree of specifically Italians living in New York because they are Italians, for example, and the media refer to it as the pizza killings, you're not reporting anything, you're making jokes. And even today, it is the same media and the same police officers who are making jokes about a chain of racist murders and investigating the victims themselves, who are now scratching their heads wondering how it could have possibly ever happened. But moving on from hate crimes and the Verfassungsschutz, what about the German capitalists who got to keep all the profits they made from the Holocaust and the war? Where are they today, and who do they support? Before I get into that, I'll briefly explain the 7 most popular German political parties. The Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Social Union are 2 right-wing Christian conservative neoliberal parties and are the same parties that routinely platformed Nazis after the end of the Second World War. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, the Free Democratic Party, and the Green Party form a coalition government and are all your standard social justice, neoliberal, center-to-center-right parties. Die Linke, or the left, is what remains of the party that governed East Germany, and is the most left-wing party that has seats in the Bundestag. And I say most left-wing quite loosely, as they're at best standard social democrats who advocate for basic things like taxing the rich, funding social programs, and demilitarization. They've been around since the 2000s, aren't really that popular in Germany, and honestly haven't accomplished too much or said anything that radical. Despite this, journalists from German media outlets like Der Spiegel to more international ones like the BBC have described the party to be far left and extremist in nature. The Verfassungsschutz also pays particularly close attention to its members. And then we have the AfD, or the Alternative for Germany. So then, what does the AfD support? Well, first off, they're a right-wing nationalist conservative party that is anti-immigration, doesn't believe in climate change, wants to restrict abortion rights, are against same-sex marriage, and wants tax cuts for the rich. Politicians in the AfD have repeatedly come under criticism for making comments that trivialize the Holocaust, that is, when they aren't full-out denying it. One of the leading figures in the AfD is Björn Höcke, who lost a court case here in Germany that determined calling him a fascist isn't libel because it's true. 20% of AfD members are also members of the far-right extremist group Der Flügel, which describes itself and the AfD as a resistance movement against the further erosion of the identity of Germany. Even though they've always been against all immigration, even those seeking asylum, that just isn't enough for them, as they've recently been discovered to have been having talks with other far-right German and Austrian parties about not just preventing immigrants from entering, but also forcefully re-migrating immigrants who are staying in Germany legally, including those who have German citizenship. Seems like a fringe group of racist extremists, right? Well, in Germany, parties like that are the second most popular party in the country, with recent polls showing support for the AfD to float around the 23% mark. But then, who supports the AfD's growth? Finding your voter base is all good, but even with all the support they get in the ballots and personal donations, who actually pays these politicians and funds the organizational aspects of the party? In the past few years, the AfD has been campaigning and promoting itself like crazy, with estimates about how much this non-stop campaigning costs going as high as 10 million. Now, even though the AfD's politicians are mostly made up of upper-class Germans, 10 million has got to come from somewhere, so who is giving this neo-Nazi party so much money? Well, one thing you should know is that in Germany, political funding needs to be transparent. Parties need to disclose the sources and uses of their funds. And to be fair, if you look up AfD donation lists, you can find a list of individuals that have no problem donating to them openly. But if you're someone like, say, August von Fink Jr., a German billionaire whose father supported and funded the Nazi Party, it kind of looks bad if you're doing the same thing. So instead, you could create an organization that, out of their own free will, puts up thousands of pro-AfD voter posters around election time. You could fund newspapers that write pro-AfD articles and then distribute them for free. You could even hire some totally unbiased media analysts to conduct a study on which papers in Germany tell the truth and name your market partner, the Preußische Allgemeine Zeitung, another far-right newspaper, the most honest newspaper in Germany. And for legal reasons, I have to say, none of this is confirmed. It's all just coincidences and speculations. The same way that it's just a coincidence that in 2010, August von Fink Jr. became involved in the gold industry and opened up a shop in Munich, which coincidentally would be the very same gold sold on the AfD's online gold shop that they ran to raise funds for their party. And while all of that looks bad enough, it actually gets worse. In 2017, Ernst Knut Stahl, a businessman who works closely with August von Fink Jr., had a meeting with the Bavarian journalist and publisher. In a statement made under oath, the conversation started with Ernst saying, "There is danger ahead. There is a street in New York with lots of investment bankers, lawyers, and so forth. Coincidentally, they are all Jews, but that's not relevant here. They want to push Germany into ruin. They control everything." It was in this conversation that the creation of the Deutschland Kurier, a far-right newspaper here in Germany, was first proposed. And since then, it's been hiring AfD politicians and sympathetic journalists to write pro-right-wing policy articles and stroking fear of migrants. Another recent donation scandal the AfD was involved in was an illegal donation scandal where Henning Kohl, a UK-based billionaire landlord, donated over 100,000 euros and just never wanted it to be disclosed. Now, look, we can go through AfD donors and donations to specific politicians all day, but I think the most important thing to talk about is why. Why are these super rich people donating money to a far-right political party? And I guess the answer to that would be, why wouldn't they? These right-wing parties support policies that make them more money while having to pay less in return. If you are a billionaire looking to see who is going to help you personally in politics, you don't really care about things like there being almost 1 million long-term unemployed people in your country, 21% of the people living in your country, or around 17 million people being affected by poverty, or having over 600,000 people in Germany dealing with homelessness in one of the world's richest countries. These things don't affect you, your family, or your social circle. In fact, you probably don't even know any homeless or poor people, and you're certainly never at risk of it. It's better to support the parties that ignore these issues, blame them all on foreigners, and will make you the most money. And it's also better for you that the public supports these parties too. If a growing number of people are becoming at risk of poverty, with homelessness rising, housing and jobs becoming harder to find, and life becoming harder and harder for the average German, well, then it's a lot better for you as a billionaire for those Germans to look for solutions along national and racial lines rather than class lines. For example, imagine if all these working class people with the same problem, whether they be German, Turkish, Syrian, Ukrainian, or whatever, living in Germany all got together and said, "Hey, we're actually not so different from each other and our problems are almost identical. You need a place to live, you need to eat, you need a job, you need to feel like your life means something. Why is this tiny class of people making so much money off of us and not contributing their fair share to the society they belong to? Maybe they should stop doing that." Well, that would be a problem, wouldn't it? But if you pump so much money into political parties and propaganda that paints it as us Germans versus the others, or us Europeans versus the others, then suddenly the issue isn't anything structural that needs to be changed. It's these goddamn foreigners who won't stay in their own war-torn countries, who want to come here and destroy our culture, make us unsafe, and take our jobs that need to be stopped. It's no surprise that one of the most important issues that unite AfD voters together is that the party addresses the quote-unquote migrant and refugee question, whereas every other party just kind of ignores the issue entirely. And make no mistake, the AfD will deal with immigrants, one way or the other, but the question still remains, what exactly does this change for the average German? And let's return back to the example of this hypothetical German party that addresses issues along class lines instead of national lines. Would it even be allowed to exist? We've already talked about why industrialists and other billionaires would donate millions to right-wing parties, but why exactly would any industrialist or billionaire donate any money to left-wing parties? It's not exactly a fair fight, is it? It's more like an uphill battle where your opponent also owns the hill. If it's still too confusing and hypothetical for you, I'd like to again recommend you the 3-part video series about the German Revolution I recommended earlier, because it discusses a lot of the same stuff. If that's too historical or removed from the present for you, then let me give you a more concrete example of what's happening literally right now. How German billionaires support increasingly more right-wing causes and fan violence in the United States for profit. Now, Germany makes a lot of weapons. In 2023, Germany made almost 12 billion euros in weapon exports alone, and they make so many weapons that they're the 4th highest ranking country when it comes to weapon exports, behind only the USA, Russia, and France. But on top of the missiles and explosives they sell to kill people in other countries, they also make a lot of guns for Germans to buy to kill people in their own country. Now, while Germany certainly isn't perfect in their gun control laws, they certainly are better than countries like the US, for example. About 1 million Germans legally own at least one firearm, whether that be for personal reasons or for sports. But it's safe to say that Germany simply doesn't have as big of a gun culture as the United States. Now, if you're a weapons manufacturer whose only goal is to keep making money, there's only so many wars and so many Germans you can sell your weapons to. But luckily for them, one of their country's closest allies has an insane, never-ending consumerist gun culture. It shouldn't at all be controversial to say that Americans are obsessed with guns, and a big part of that culture is the NRA, or the National Rifle Association of America, a gun rights and lobbying group. Now, the NRA coincidentally makes a lot of money. A pretty sizable portion of that money comes from contributions and funders, sometimes individuals, but often companies. Now, contributions can come in different forms. You can simply work with them, set up stands at their rallies and get-togethers, promoting your brand like companies Heckler & Koch and Walter do. Or you could go even further and be like Sig Sauer, one of the most successful firearm manufacturers in the world, and go the next step, donating so much money that on the NRA website, they specifically note that Sig Sauer took it to the next level with the Golden Ring of Freedom. The website notes that Golden Ring of Freedom members are premier patriots who have given gifts or cash or assets to the NRA totaling $1 million or more to defend our most cherished values, rights, and traditions. But Sig Sauer isn't just a wealthy German-American patriot who donates at least $1 million to the NRA. No. Sig Sauer weapons are the weapon of choice for 1/3 of American police officers. Sig Sauer weapons are the weapon of choice for many mass shooters as well, but most famously the Sandy Hook school shooting and the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting. Now, I can hear people typing away, yeah, but Sig Sauer has nothing to do with that. They just make the guns and donate to the NRA. What people do with that is not their fault, but that's not even true. On top of promoting and helping people to obtain guns, the NRA is a lobbying group that directly interferes with American politics. They lobby politicians to act on their behalf and push for laws that would make it easier to buy guns in the US and that loosen restrictions. And the easier it is to get a gun, the more people will get them, making Sig Sauer a lot of money. Those are things that have a tangible effect on American society. And it doesn't just affect guns either. The politicians that the NRA pays off, people like Marco Rubio, Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, and Ron DeSantis, are pro-gun. But they also have a huge effect on laws in the United States across the board, dealing with issues from immigration to abortion. So, now back to my previous example. There are a lot of human rights groups in the US that want to fix America's gun problem, and while several of them have different solutions, there is one thing they all have in common. None of the solutions involve people buying more guns. But human rights is bad for business, of course, so Sig Sauer will just continue giving money to the groups that keep its interests at heart, regardless of what effect it has on Americans, and those groups will continue promoting firearms, lobbying politicians, and continuing to try to make it easier to purchase them. And while Americans do have to deal with the consequences of these policies, Sig Sauer's owners and shareholders won't feel any of it. You can see how this becomes a never-ending cycle with gun manufacturers giving millions to political groups to act on their behalf. It becomes easier to buy guns, gun-related deaths increase, Americans get mad and start protesting against guns, causing said gun manufacturers to pump even more money into politicians and gun lobbying groups to even it all out again. None of what Sig Sauer does is illegal. Actually, by the rules of the system it exists in, it's actually a really smart business decision. So, Americans, remember, whenever some police officer murders an unarmed black or brown person, whenever someone gets annoyed and decides to murder their neighbor, or whenever someone for whatever reason decides to go on down to their local high school and murder a bunch of children, while Americans are offering their sincerest thoughts and prayers, in Germany, that's just good business. And while this specific real-world example is about guns in the US, what would exactly change if, say, for example, a political party or ideology started popping up that actually addresses systemic issues and wants to change how much these companies profit? What's to stop them from funding the extremists on the other side who aren't only super pro-business but are also more willing to use violence on their behalf to crush any protests in opposition? Who's to stop people like the von Finks from building up Nazi and AfD parties? With hate crimes increasing, Nazis and fascists infesting different state apparatuses, and increasing support from the German public for far-right nationalist parties, it can all look pretty bleak, and it is. Genocide Watch, an organization that investigates and warns about potential genocides, puts Germany at stage 6 out of 10 for a potential genocide. And heads up, people start getting killed at stage 8. But what about the other Germans? Not everyone is a rabid racist, and that's true, so what about the average liberal German? The AfD is terrible, but surely the SPD, the Green Party, those guys and their supporters can save us, right? Well, we've talked a lot about structural issues in this video, the way Germany was rebuilt, and the way that Nazis were intentionally reintegrated into the system. But the thing is, liberals have been a part of that system, and have been just as responsible for the Germany that exists today. The SPD, the Greens, they focus on making little concessions and tweaks within the system, but are unwilling to push for any massive change. The reality is that these parties are just as much a part of making Germany what it is today. In fact, the current chancellor, as of making this video, is an SPD politician named Olaf Scholz. And while Olaf at least openly disagrees with the AfD, he certainly doesn't have any issues or thoughts concerning the economic and political structure of his country that has created the very issues that he's now trying to address that allows billionaires and business owners to fund far-right nationalist parties unimpeded. And to really paint an accurate picture of Olaf and German liberals, I have two related examples that really summarize their entire stance quite well. On the 21st of January 2024, there was a massive anti-AfD demo in Berlin, but also throughout all of Germany to protest against the growing right-wing extremists and racism in the country. This was in response to the news that the AfD met up with some other right-wing extremists to come up with a plan to remigrate undesirables out of Germany, namely Arabs and anyone they didn't think was a true German. It was a pretty big deal. Most of the German media covered it, and so did some international outlets as well. And a lot of people came to these rallies, which is good. They were supported by Olaf Scholz, the SPD, and other members of the government, though. For context, the SPD has also been involved with ramping up deportations, pushing for reforms that make it easier to deport migrants, cutting notifications, and making it easier for police to search people and their homes. The lives of migrants and refugees in Germany is already getting worse under the SPD. The AfD might be open with their racist motivations for mass deportations, but the SPD and the Bundestag are already ramping up deportations and cutting social spending, affecting the lives of migrants and refugees in Germany. Most Germans don't really seem to see any issues with this because the existence of the AfD is understood to be like the racist bad party that they can performatively protest against, while ignoring everything else that is already happening. So, what happened at the protest? Well, the problems came when Arabs and other migrant and refugee groups tried to join the protest as well. Typically, when you're not a part of the group that's being affected by something you're protesting against, you ally yourself with the victim of that thing. That's kind of the whole point. In this case, it was Arabs and other migrant groups. It shouldn't be a surprise or an issue even that Arabs and other migrant groups who have a more personal connection to the current genocide unfolding in Gaza come to the anti-fascist, anti-racism rally wearing traditionally Palestinian clothing and waving Palestinian flags, as they are, going through a genocide at the hands of a fascist apartheid state that is funded, armed, and supported by Germany. So, if you're a white liberal German at an anti-racism rally, do you A, ally yourself with the victims of racism in your country, or B, gang up on the victims of racism in your country, spit on them, beat them, call them terrorists, and help the police remove them? You choose B, of course. I'm going to play a video from Palestinian activist Salah Saeed, someone who's been very active in the Free Palestine movement here in Berlin, and someone I've had the privilege of very briefly speaking to explain what happened at this demo.
I just came back from the anti-AfD demonstration that was organized by Fridays for Future against racism, against discrimination, for migrants, for refugees, against the right extremist organization and government we're living in. I'm shaking. I can't even cope with the amount of discrimination and repression we have faced today. Germans who attended that protest have attacked us, spat on us, violated and abused us. I can't even believe that that happened at this protest just because we were wearing keffiyehs and Palestinian flags. There was so many Israeli flags there. No one went there and asked them why they are here, asked them to leave, asked them to not be part of this. This hypocrisy and double standard has to stop. We were asked to leave the protest. People came to us and told us we don't belong to Germany. We're terrorists. They told us that we are not part of this movement. They told us that we don't belong there. Who is being discriminated and criminalized over the past couple of months? We have faced discrimination and racism our entire lives in Germany. Now you want to come out and tell us that we don't belong to an anti-AfD demo? I mean, the whole government is racist. The whole Ampelregierung has taken a very active stance to criminalize us and to abuse us on the streets on a daily basis. I feel a shame if you're German who attended that protest and you didn't protect Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. We were attacked from all sides. The police came and took us and didn't allow us to be part of the protest. We were actively being removed from the rest of the protest. The police came and surrounded us, and it's unbelievable to me what amount of hypocrisy people dare to have to go out and say they are against racism and discrimination, and they, on the other hand, come to us and attack us and call us terrorists, tell us we're not part of this, tell us we're not part of Germany, we should leave this country, we're not part of this society. Because you're uncomfortable with the uprising of the AfD, let me remind you that the Ampelregierung, SPD, FDP, Die Grüne, almost everyone in the political spectrum of Germany has been fighting us, has been discriminating us, has been saying that we don't belong to Germany and that they want to deport us. Well, where do you want to deport us to? You've already managed for the Zionists to take over our country. So where should we go? What do you expect us to do? We will not allow this, and I promise you one thing. There won't be any anti-AfD demonstration without us being there, visible and loud. Because if you want to or not, we're part of this society and we're part of Germany, and we will fight your racism and we will fight your discrimination. We are many, and we are proud, and we are loud. Free Palestine.
Now, I think what he says speaks for itself, but what I really want to focus on is the part where he mentioned the Israeli flags at the anti-AfD demo. Now, calling the AfD a fascist party isn't a stretch. They have members and platform people who are openly fascist regularly. Here are some other interesting facts about the AfD. Most of them are diehard Zionists and supporters of Israel. The AfD, more than any other German party, opposes the BDS movement, which boycotts Israel, citing anti-Semitism as the reason. In fact, 77% of AfD members think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. The majority of AfD members support weapons exports to Israel, and 88% of AfD members think that Israel's birthday should be a reason for Germans to celebrate. Now, the idea that the AfD actually cares about anti-Semitism is clearly not the case. So let me put forth another suggestion. You know the saying game recognizes game? Yeah, well, it's kind of the same thing for fascists. And if you take issue with me calling Israel a fascist apartheid state, you should watch an older video of mine where I talked all about its history and its current policies. Just to recap, White liberal Germans get together to protest the AfD and racism in their country, but anytime an actual person of color, the people being victimized by the very thing you're protesting against, from a country that's currently going through a genocide that is funded and armed by Germany, shows up, their mere presence makes them so uncomfortable that they have to verbalize it, attack them, and remove them. All of this while they protest next to people holding Israeli flags, a fascist, racist apartheid state that is doing the genocide and is also supported by the very thing that they're protesting against. It's very concerning that for all the learning German kids are supposedly doing in schools about the Holocaust and the Nazis, they are shockingly terrible at recognizing fascism if it isn't marked with a swastika. And I also have to ask, who are they aligning themselves with? Because it certainly isn't migrants or Arabs or anyone the AfD is actively targeting. It feels like liberal Germans who deep down know racism is wrong but don't have any interest in thinking about their biases are chanting Germany is for Germans but not in the racist Nazi way. The events revolving around this anti-racism rally are so hypocritical, so tone-deaf, and so genuinely cruel that they could only happen in a country like Germany. In a country that is dedicated to denazification and combating racism on a purely aesthetic level, with no consideration for the actual institutions and social beliefs and structures that allow these ideologies to grow. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about before my conclusion is Germany's response to the genocide in Gaza. On official government websites, you can find the quote that describes both Olaf Scholz and the German government's position on the genocide. The security of Israel is and will remain the raison d'etre of the state of Germany. This remains true even during difficult times such as these, and we will act accordingly. This statement was made directly to Netanyahu, by the way, something that will come into more importance in a bit. This unconditional support that has taken the form of both a tenfold increase in arms exports to Israel, making up almost 30% of all Israeli military imports, as well as calling the International Court of Justice's ruling that Israel was plausibly committing genocide as completely unfounded and a political instrumentation of the charge. If you actually want to read through the court documents and look through the pages of evidence in the form of specific massacres, intentional killings, and expressed intent of genocide by Israeli officials, that Germany calls completely unfounded, I highly recommend reading South Africa's case against Israel, which I've linked in this video. In fact, the support has been so overwhelming and explicit that Germany has officially been accused of aiding and abetting genocide by both Nicaragua and by German lawyers who are suing members of their own government. Whether Germany, its government officials, and its institutions are supporting genocide is not a question anymore, it's a fact. Germany is aiding and abetting one of the most clear-cut cases of genocide uncritically and unconditionally. Prime Minister Olaf Scholz, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, other members of the government and its supporters should be spoken and thought about in the same terms you would speak and think about other groups of people who are complicit in genocide. Now, before I get into the German media and the German public's reaction, there's two things I want to say about Germany's uncritical support of and alliance with Israel. The current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the person who received those words of affirmation from Olaf Scholz earlier. Now, an interesting thing about Netanyahu is that he somehow actually blames Muslims for giving Hitler the idea to kill all Jewish people in Europe.
Hitler didn't want to exterminate the Jews at the time, he wanted to expel the Jews. And Haj Amin al-Husseini went to Hitler and said, if you expel them, they'll all come here. So what should I do with them? He asked. He said, burn them.
Now, this claim can be disproven in two ways. The first way is basic history. The meeting he's talking about between Hitler and the Grand Mufti of Palestine happened in 1941, and Jews had already been getting killed in Europe since at least 1939. The Nazis had already been discussing the final solution long before that meeting even took place. The second is just context. The Grand Mufti's name was Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was an anti-Semite, but that's not the point. Elections were held for the Mufti of Palestine, and Haj Amin al-Husseini was one of the 4 candidates, but he received the lowest amount of votes. But then the British, who controlled Palestine at the time, just decided to make him the Grand Mufti anyway, because a person like al-Husseini would divide the Palestinian leadership structure, which was their goal. Al-Husseini was not a representative of Palestine in any meaningful way, and he certainly didn't convince Hitler to do genocide. Netanyahu's position on this amounts to trivializing both Hitler's and Germans' involvement in the Holocaust to stoke hate for Muslims in Israel. He's been criticized for this internationally and within Israel, but never really changed his mind. Next thing I need to talk about is this guy here. Now, this guy kissing Netanyahu is a prominent political activist for the Likud party, and clearly a Netanyahu superfan named Itzhak Zarka. Now, just a few months ago, a video came out of Itzhak Zarka at a protest where he shouted the phrase, "Ashkenazim whores, may you burn in hell. I am proud of the 6 million who burned, and I wish another 6 million would burn." Not really anything I can say that can make that sound worse than it already is, but just want to reiterate, on top of the literal genocide that's being conducted right now, this is the specific person that the German state chooses to align itself with, a person who thinks that Muslims actually caused the Holocaust, and that Hitler actually just wanted to remigrate Jews out of Europe, who is supported by the type of people who are proud of 6 million people being systematically killed. Now, this next part might be a little disorganized, but being here in Germany, I've noted quite a few things that have caught my eye, and I just wanted to list them off here. Graffiti throughout Germany with the words "kill all Palestinians" and other racist sayings written in places like schools. One particularly shocking one I found was that of a Muslim cemetery who had its graves spray painted over with Stars of David and swastikas. In fact, this very open display of anti-Muslim racism isn't just carried out by individuals, but by larger organizations and the state itself. Like, for example, here, where a parade in Dusseldorf recently had a float that depicted Palestinians as dogs, symbolized here with the collar of the dog being the colors of the Palestinian flag, and the word hate written on it. Next to it stood another dog with the word violence written on it. You can read this article here, written 2 years ago, about how the subject of Palestine is approached in German schools, with specific incidents including teachers instructing their students to refer to Palestinians as Jordanians and calling the keffiyehs a terrorist scarf. But since October 7th, it's gotten a lot worse. For example, schools in Berlin are now distributing leaflets that describe the 1948 Nakba, or the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from conquered Israeli land, as a myth. Now, the Nakba is a 100% verifiable historical fact because we have both victims who survived it attesting to what happened and also perpetrators of it gloating about it still alive. We even have super pro-Israeli historians like Benny Morris who don't even dispute that the Nakba happened. It's a fact. The Nakba is a fact, and German teachers are teaching their children that it's an anti-Semitic myth. Another thing that happened was at this year's Berlinale, where an Israeli film won the award for Best Documentary for the film No Other Land, a documentary about the systemic erasure of Palestinian life in the West Bank. While accepting the award, Basil Adra, a Palestinian, and Yuval Abraham, a Jewish Israeli, gave a speech where they correctly called Israel an apartheid state and called for a ceasefire. By now, it should be to nobody's surprise that German officials called Yuval, a Jewish man, anti-Semitic, and condemned him for his speech. Yuval had this to say: "To stand on German soil as the son of Holocaust survivors and call for a ceasefire, and to then be labeled as anti-Semitic is not only outrageous, it is also literally putting Jewish lives in danger. I don't know what Germany is trying to do with us, but if this is Germany's way of dealing with its guilt over the Holocaust, they are emptying it of all meaning." I couldn't agree more. Actually, the German state and media have a bad habit of calling anything they don't like anti-Semitic, terrorist, or Islamist. One that made me chuckle just because of how ridiculous the claim was this one instance in the German media where a Muslim football player by the name of Antonio Rüdiger was portrayed to be a supporter of ISIS because he did a very common Muslim prayer sign during Ramadan. The slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," was criminalized in Berlin for being an incitement to violence, and other protests have been described as Jew-hating rallies. Now, what can I say? This is a country who arrests Jewish people for being anti-Semitic. It's clearly beyond any cohesive logic, so I want to instead read part of an article written by an anti-Zionist Jewish activist in Berlin, of which I promise you there are many, of her experience in Germany. "I am a Jewish pro-Palestine solidarity activist originally from the New York area and now based in Berlin. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor from Köln who fled to the United States during the Second World War at the age of 16. Her parents and much of her family were murdered during the Holocaust. I came back to Germany about 5 years ago, a decision born largely out of the desire for intergenerational healing for me and for my grandmother who was alive at the time. I learned German and was able to speak to her in her native language in the last few years of her life. I told her stories about living in Germany, she met some of my friends, and she was grateful for the ways in which the country and its people had apparently evolved and atoned for their ugly history." I am glad she died before I had the opportunity to recognize what a naive, idealistic delusion this was. More than 90% of all anti-Semitic incidents in Germany are attributable to the far right, despite the media's rampant efforts to ignore statistics, skew the reality of the violence and racism directed at Palestinians, and disguise the true apathy towards the so-called fight against anti-Semitism. While actual incidents of anti-Semitism go largely unpunished, those of us standing in solidarity with Palestine are accustomed to brutal state-sanctioned violence, repression, and surveillance from police, and the German government in response to peaceful protests and boycotts. This has intensified massively since the genocide in Gaza began in October, regularly under the guise of accusations of anti-Semitism and Judenhass. On February 3rd, I attended an anti-AfD demonstration in Berlin as part of the pro-Palestinian bloc with the revolutionary Marxist group Sozialismus von unten. An older German man with an aggressive expression approached me, stopped in front of me, and half shouted, "So what do you think the similarities are between the AfD and Israel?" I could tell he had no intention of engaging in a reasonable conversation, but nonetheless began trying to explain. After a few words, he rolled his eyes and spat at me. I ran after the man, shouting at him that my family was murdered because of fascism during a genocide, in response to which he spat at me again. He goaded me. "What do you know? The AfD is a fascist party. What does that have to do with Israel?" I began to state the obvious. Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza as we speak, but didn't finish my sentence before he spat in my face for a third time. As I was shaking, incensed and disgusted, my final comment was, "You are clearly an anti-Semite." Up to this point in the interaction, he had been condescending and full of contempt, but this final shot sent him into a blind rage. As I turned and walked away, he shrieked, "What did you say to me?" A friend of mine recently said to me, "The Germans will never forgive the Jews for the Holocaust." These words have rung in my ears and sat in my chest with nowhere in particular to go. A hard, ugly truth at the core of German society that precisely reflects my experience living in it. It is bewildering, it is comical, and it is accurate. It should be of no surprise that as soon as they were given the permission to, police started acting violently towards pro-Palestine protesters. Now, I live in Berlin, home to one of the biggest Palestinian diaspora communities in Europe, so I want to share some of my experiences. I remember one of the first ones I went to in Potsdamer Platz, where the police surrounded the demonstration on all sides with loudspeakers, declaring the protest to be illegal and for us to leave. When no one did, they started forming lines and walking through the crowds and forced us to separate. They didn't hold back either. They took out their batons, they took out whatever they used to spray people in the eyes with and used them both liberally. They've been arresting people on the streets. I've even seen teenagers and kids dragged out of restaurants from their parents off the streets to be searched by the police. There is a near constant police presence in Neukölln and in Sonnenallee, part of the city that is home to a lot of different migrant and refugee groups, but specifically lots of Palestinian refugees. I'm not Arab, but I've been mistaken for being Arab before, and yeah, the German police search your bags by force. They ask you if you have weapons or rocks. They ask you to put away Palestinian flags. They make you take off keffiyehs. One of the most memorable things that has happened in Berlin was one night, while Palestinians and their allies came together to mourn their losses, specifically children, by lighting some candles and leaving them on the street. Police came by, forced people to leave, and began stepping on the candles and the memorials that have been left to honor the dead, an act I can only describe as coming from a place of pure hate. Recently, a police officer was heard telling Palestinian kids that their very existence in Germany was the problem. Police have raided office buildings, apartment buildings, and even coffee shops that exist to support immigrants for suspicion of terrorism based on Instagram posts. This is the country run by the liberals of Germany, being supported by Germany's right and the so-called German left. I'm struggling with how to end this part of the video, but I think the actions of the German state speak loudly enough for themselves. So instead, I want to read another part of a letter written by a Jewish activist directly to Barbara Slowik, the president of the police in Berlin. Dear Frau Dr. Slowik, we met this past summer while having a shared meal with a mutual friend at a Chinese restaurant in Berlin. I wanted to write to you as an American Jew living in Berlin that I am absolutely shocked and horrified by the atrocities carried out by the Berlin police force in the past months. As a Jew living in Germany, the greatest threat to my safety is not the Muslim, Palestinian, or immigrant population as the government wants us to believe, but the state itself, especially its violent articulation through the Polizei Berlin. As a Jew, it has been critically important for me to stand against the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza. It is critically important for me to define what my Judaism means and what it stands for, and what my political beliefs are. I have seen and learned of numerous accounts of Jewish and Jewish ally protesters being violently arrested and even given false charges of Volksverhetzung, or insulting police officers. I have personally witnessed some of these cases. The victims, who are often Jewish, personal friends and or friends working closely with Jewish communities, are attacked by police and sent into vans. There are absolutely no ethical grounds to charge Jews or Jewish allies with anti-Semitism, especially those who strictly follow the laws, which seem to become more arbitrary every day. There have also been intensive raids of Berlin establishments cherished by our communities. Most critically, the police's violent criminalization of and assaults on the Palestinian community is beyond disturbing. As someone surviving the legacy of what Germany's forefathers have done, that is the genocide of the non-white Christian Germany, I am absolutely shocked and saddened to see what the police do time and time again to the Palestinian people. I understand that the police may have orders, they may be following instructions, but so did Eichmann. And yes, it is that serious, it is that urgent, and I will make that comparison. We as Jews, in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters and siblings, are seeing the rise, again, of a white Christian supremacist fascism, which is being carried out violently by the police force. I have decided to leave this country for good, not due to the so-called imported anti-Semitism, but by the very real anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim racism, and extreme anti-Palestinian violence of the German police and state. I beg of you with all of my heart to please do everything within your power to stop the violence, to stop the oppression, stop the attacks on our precious communities, stop the threats against all non-Aryans. Please listen. If you really want to protect the Jewish community, you must protect all minority groups, especially Palestinians. We are more similar than Germany likes to believe, and one group cannot be safe if the other is endangered. You have the power to make a change. You have the power to really make sure never again is never again. Please help to prevent another iteration of a German police force acting out unthinkable violence and oppression. We have already been here before. I pray that this time we can turn around before it's too late. Recently, I got the chance to watch The Zone of Interest in theaters, and I really enjoyed it. Can't lie, I was pretty sleepy, but I still remember the visuals and the audio vividly. The film follows the life of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, as he lives his day-to-day life with his wife as they raise their kids and struggle to deal with the fact that he's getting a promotion. We never even get to see the inside of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The entire film focuses on just the family, but we do get to hear what happens in the camp. We do get to see the smoke from the trains pulling up to the camp. Throughout the movie, we never get to forget that the camp is actually there, even though the only thing we ever see of it is the wall, which happens to be just against the side of their family home. But the family itself never seems to be bothered by this fact. They're so used to it, so uncaring and so unconsidering of the people being killed literally right next to them that it is just background noise. They can have conversations about building a good home for their kids in hearing range from executions without thinking twice. In interviews, the film's director, Jonathan Glazer, says this is not about the past, it's about now. It's easy to look back on history and realize how wrong something was, to condemn it from where we're standing now. But those people, they thought that they were just living their lives. They justified everything that was happening around them as an unfortunate but necessary event, as self-defense, as out of their control, and they were confident in their beliefs. They were sure that their life was normal. How could we be so sure that our lives aren't unfolding next to and supported by a similar misery that we're also justifying to ourselves? How the Holocaust is remembered and spoken about in Germany is complicated. The memory of the Holocaust is present. There are plaques, memorials, statues all over the country. It's taught about in schools, and it is talked about on German television. But Germans are becoming more and more irritated with this guilt, with the second most popular party in Germany, the AfD, when it even recognizes the Holocaust happened, wanting to move on from it. Recently, a poll found that almost 36% of German citizens surveyed believe that their ancestors were victims of Nazi rule. 32% think their ancestors helped potential victims. In fact, it was a few 0% Olaf Scholz said it himself, but Israel is seen as this shining light, this raison d'etre, this chance of making up for the Holocaust. But you can't. You can't make up for the Holocaust. Maybe what Germans should be feeling isn't just guilt, but also a sense of responsibility to make sure that things like this never happen again. You cannot stack good deeds on top of performative actions that make the Holocaust okay, because it will never be okay. And I have to ask now, after all of this, after Nazis being reintegrated into the state, after the way Germans remember and talk about their own history, after Germany's response is unwavering loyalty to a country who is committing one of the most blatant examples of genocide in modern history, is this how a country would act if making sure history doesn't repeat itself was even marginally considered? Some Germans like to look at this period in history as a stain on an otherwise spotless record, and it isn't fair that Germans aren't allowed to be as patriotic or proud of their history as other Europeans. But let's look at what they were doing before World War II. Well, there was World War I, but also look, another genocide in Namibia. A genocide that isn't taught about in schools, that is ignored in the public consciousness, a genocide that was only just in 2021 officially recognized as genocide in Germany. It only took 110 years. And hey, if the German state really cared, then maybe they could do something about the fact that German Namibians make up 2% of Namibia's 2.5 million population, but own about 70% of the country's land.
They want the land back? How? Sorry, but that's just, I mean, really? It's not even their land. If they wanted their land, then they should have done something 100 years ago.
Whenever the Gazan genocide ends, everything will come out. We'll get more information about what actually happened on the ground, testimonies from survivors and perpetrators, a death toll, and I can already guess how it's going to go in Germany. People will say, oh, it was so horrible, if only we knew what was actually happening, if only we had more information, then maybe we could have done something. But Germans and the entire world already know what's happening. Germans are not the victims of this situation, no matter how they will try to portray themselves in the future. They are explicitly aligned with the perpetrators. And now I have to say this. Obviously, not all Germans are like this. Even as my opinion of Europe worsens with time, I meet all sorts of Germans, all the time, who are passionate and committed to a free Palestine, progressive movements, correcting their country's past mistakes, actually ensuring that it doesn't happen again, and building international solidarity. I don't say this to shift the blame away from Germany. I think any person who lives in and benefits from a country that engages in imperialism and warfare shouldn't feel innocent. But instead of feeling bad or guilty, I think there's something else you should feel instead. Anger. Anger that you live in a country that props itself up on the destruction and death of a people all over the world, and anger that no matter which way you vote and which way you express your disapproval, at best, no one hears you and nothing changes, and at worst, you're met with state violence. I say all of this to enforce my final point. The German government, its members who are complicit in its crimes, the police who defend it unconditionally, and the civilians who support it, like us all, have made a choice. It is a conscious decision, either born out of intentional racism and maliciousness, or a deep ignorance and carelessness about the world, that is made every single day to support a system that is creeping backwards into its own history, is supporting settler colonialism, and coddles the murderers who conduct it, whether they as individuals recognize it or not.